TV is the future. Because as high-quality film productions become more cost-effective, and as new distribution channels have opened up a huge range of markets hungry for content, TV has combined the best of film with the best of serial narrative, ushering us into an age of gorgeously visual, long-form storytelling. So over the next 5 lectures, we'll take everything we've learned about film scripts and we'll apply it to TV. For a long time, TV was dismissed as a cheap knockoff of film, but over the past decade its reputation has caught up, and we're now living in what's often called the golden age of television. In the United States alone, there are over 400 scripted series on the air, many of them so prestigious and popular that they've lured major movie stars to the second screen. The Sopranos is usually credited with kicking off this new era in 1999, and since then, TV has given us The Wire and Mad Men and 30 Rock and Friday Night Lights and Lost and dozens of other series listed by the Writers Guild of America as the best of all time. Now, this new respect for TV is marvelous, but the 50 preceding years were hardly the dark ages. There have always been good shows on TV, innovative shows, powerful shows. I Love Lucy, The Twilight Zone, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, All in the Family. The list goes on. So why was TV looked down on for so long, and why is it so celebrated now? The answer is that TV differs from film in a few key ways that can be seen either as flaws or virtues, depending on your point of view. So in this lecture, we'll explain the reasons for these differences between film and TV by tracing them back to a single innovation in the way that TV handles conflict. Then we'll explore what this innovation means from a writer's perspective, preparing us for the next 4 lectures where we'll learn to write for TV ourselves. So let's start with the most obvious difference between film and TV, and that's the vast difference in quantity. An average movie is 2 hours. An average TV series is designed to run for 100 hours or more. If you like imaginative storytelling, that additional quality is a boon. But from a writer's perspective, it poses a huge challenge. How on earth do you generate all those hours of material? Well, you do it by building what screenwriters call an engine. This engine keeps powering the story forward, episode after episode, season after season. There are different ways to build a TV engine, but the most straightforward is by establishing a deep conflict in the story world. Conflict, as we've seen in previous lectures, is the driver of action. It's what pushes the plot. So the deeper and more substantial the conflict, the more story you can get out of it. As a result, TV shows are typically anchored in a conflict within the story world, rather than a conflict between the story world and character. The world is much bigger than a character, so if there's a conflict in the world, it can go on indefinitely. This repeated conflict also achieves another necessary goal of TV writing, which is consistency. Writing for TV is like working in a famous restaurant. Audiences don't just want to know that they'll be served a regular meal, they want that meal to taste the same every time. If they want variety, they'll go to a different restaurant or they'll turn the channel. So if they come back to you a second time, and then a third and a fourth time, and so on, they'll want to repeat the same positive experience they had before. And to provide a consistently positive TV experience, you have to make sure that every episode of your series generates the same cognitive effect. That's why it helps for TV shows to anchor conflict in the story world. When scripts instead anchor conflict between story world and character, as they typically do in film, the result is a journey over which either the story world or the character is transformed. In TV, we don't want that transformation. We want audiences to experience the same thing again and again. And that's what happens when a script establishes an ongoing conflict within the story world. That conflict is bigger than any individual, so no matter what happens with the characters, whether they triumph or change or even die, the story world rolls on, cranking out the same kinds of storylines with the same cognitive effects. So by rooting conflict in the story world, TV writers allow for 2 key things needed to please audiences for hundreds of hours. First, they keep the plot going. And second, they keep the viewing experience constant. This emphasis on generating a large body of consistent material has often led TV writing to be stigmatized as formulaic, the artistic equivalent of an industrial assembly line. But the more you learn about TV engines, the more you'll see that it's not helpful to think of TV scripts in terms of formulaic plots. To start with, the degree to which TV plots are formulaic is dramatically overstated. It's true that certain kinds of genres seem more patterned than others. Network sitcoms have certain consistent rhythms, often tied to the need to hit regular commercial breaks. Police procedurals typically begin with a crime and end with a solution. And it's also true that individual shows can quickly settle into their own structural grooves. Maybe they start each episode with a witty teaser or a dilemma. Maybe they close each episode with a heartfelt epiphany or cliffhanger. But even the most regularly plotted shows deviate constantly from past precedent. Some sitcom episodes have A and B plots, but others have A and B and C and D plots, and others just have A plots. Or take, for example, Law & Order, which is often held up as a model of formulaic plotting. The formula seems to be right there in the title. In the first half of every episode, the cops investigate a crime. That's the law. In the second half of every episode, the DAs prosecute the criminal. That's the order. But in fact, individual episodes of Law & Order depart wildly from this format. Sometimes the arrest is made quickly, and the prosecution takes up most of the show. Sometimes the investigation drags on, and the trial is a quick formality. Sometimes the cops catch the wrong guy and have to repeat their investigation. Sometimes the lawyers bungle their case. Sometimes the jury convicts someone who seems innocent. Sometimes the guilty go free. So there is no consistent plot formula to Law & Order. But there is one thing that remains absolutely consistent throughout every beat of every episode, and that's the engine, the core conflict in the story world. In Law & Order, this conflict is the ongoing struggle between the ordered procedures of the American justice system and the anarchic forces of life outside. Every episode, the American justice system tries to combat crime through the same two-beat process: police investigation, DA prosecution. And every episode, this tidy, two-beat process is challenged by the intemperate appetites of criminals and the unreliability of witnesses and the randomness of juries and other wild and unruly elements that throw the cops and the courts into confusion. What led to this ugly mess of a crime scene? What's a real clue and what's a fluky coincidence? Who's misremembering a fact or lawlessly not telling the truth? Where did the witness disappear to? Will the suspect turn on his confederates? Will the jury hang? The more that the ordered procedures of the law gain the upper hand, the more that the plot moves towards the simple dum-dum of a successful investigation, successful prosecution. But the more that the chaotic helter-skelter of life's disorder gains the upper hand, the more that this dum-dum is delayed, ground to a halt, and forced to retreat. As the investigation struggles, the entrance of the DAs into the story is held off longer and longer, and the narrative can even reverse course and move back from the DAs to the cops as the prosecution breaks down. Because this conflict inheres in the story world of Law & Order, it's bigger than any of the characters. Season after season, new cops come and new cops go. New lawyers come and new lawyers go. Every episode, there's a fresh set of criminal antagonists. In some episodes, even the cops and the lawyers succumb to chaos and misrule. Sometimes their vanity or their ego or their impatience leads them to cut corners. Sometimes they just get unlucky or make a mistake. But as characters stumble and plots twist and turn, the force that drives all these changes remains steadfastly consistent. It's always a conflict between law and chaos, between the two-beat procedure of the justice system and the anarchic disruptions of life's entropic underworld. This consistency of the story world is what keeps the audience's experience constant. No matter what episode of Law & Order you watch, no matter who the characters are or what happens in the plot, the show's engine always generates the same cognitive mixture of intrigue and suspense. By pulling us, the viewers, between order and chaos, between the tidy facts before us and the sudden twists that disrupt those certainties, each episode encourages us to have sudden epiphanies about whodunit, and then to second-guess ourselves, to get a hunch about what the jury will decide, and then to question it, to decide that we were right all along, and then to hesitate once again. That's the cognitive experience of watching Law & Order every time. And at the end of every episode, if you enjoyed that cognitive experience of suspenseful curiosity, you immediately want to watch another episode to prolong the feeling. The big lesson here is that when you're writing a TV series, you want to focus on the deep conflict in the story world, not on superficial plot formulas. Audiences don't tune in for plot formulas. They want psychological consistency, not story beat predictability. And in fact, if your plots become predictable, audiences will quickly get bored and tune out. Instead, good TV writing comes from building a strong and original story engine, so that every episode of your TV series delivers the same special viewing experience. It always feels like your TV show, and it never feels like any other TV show. So that's the big difference between TV and film. Films have a one-off conflict between story world and character. TV requires an engine of ongoing conflict within the story world that keeps the plot going and the viewing experience constant. To get a little deeper into the nuts and bolts of this difference between film and TV, let's now contrast a specific film with a specific TV show. And to keep the comparison as clear as possible, let's make the film and the TV show the same. In terms of raw audience share, the most successful American TV series of all time was MASH, which ran on CBS from 1972 to 1983, and which had a series finale that drew 106 million viewers, or almost half of the US population. And this TV series was based on the enormously popular film of the same name, which was the third highest grossing film of 1970, managing even to beat out the Oscar-winning Patton. So to explore the deep difference between writing successfully for film and writing successfully for TV, let's see how MASH the film became a blockbuster by establishing a conflict between story world and character, and let's see how MASH the TV show became an equally big hit by establishing a conflict just within the story world. We'll begin, as always, by turning to the endings of our two scripts and reverse engineering from their cognitive effects. So if you haven't had a chance to read the scripts for MASH the film or for MASH the TV show's series finale, now's the time to hit pause so that you can enjoy them. On a superficial level, the endings of MASH the film and MASH the TV series seem the same. In both, a pair of doctors working in a MASH unit during the Korean War pack up their medical kits and return to America. But the cognitive effects of these two endings are very different. In the film, the two main doctors drive away in the Jeep they stole at the beginning as a loudspeaker blares out an ironic final comment on the movie.
Attention! Tonight's movie has been MASH. Follow the zany antics of our combat surgeons as they cut and stitch their way along the front lines. Starring Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, Tom Skerritt, Sally Kellerman, Robert Duvall. That is all.
This can seem a very bizarre way to end a script, but it borrows directly from Bertolt Brecht, the originator of the alienation effect, which we discussed back in our lecture on Do the Right Thing. Brecht used to have his actors change their costumes on stage to call attention to the fact that it was all just a show, and the loudspeaker in MASH has exactly the same effect. It announces that MASH is just a performance, and it undresses its characters, revealing that they're just actors playing a part. And also like Brecht, the ending of MASH bends the plot into a giant loop. In Brecht's play, Mother Courage and Her Children, the script ends on exactly the same story beat that it begins on, showing the same wagon as it pulls through the same war zone. MASH follows this blueprint scrupulously as the doctors drive away in the same Jeep that they came in, and the war continues on just as it was. This alienation effect denies emotional closure to the audience. Instead, it makes us uncomfortably aware that the horror of war is persisting unabated, encouraging us to stand up and make changes to the world. So our conflict is clearly against the world of war. MASH, the TV show, ends with a very different cognitive effect. The final episode of the TV series concludes with BJ and Hawkeye parting company after the war has already ended.
Look, I know how tough it is for you to say goodbye, so I'll say it. Maybe you're right. Maybe we'll see each other again. But in case we don't, I want you to know how much you've meant to me. I'll never be able to shake you. Whenever I see a big pair of feet or a cheesy mustache, I'll think of you.
Whenever I smell month-old socks, I'll think of you.
And the next time somebody nails my shoe to the floor.
And when somebody gives me a martini that tastes like lighter fluid,
I'll miss you.
I'll miss you a lot. I can't imagine what this place would have been like if I hadn't found you here.
Then Hawkeye and BJ hug. And as Hawkeye looks down from his chopper, he sees that BJ has written out a message for him. It's the word goodbye, spelled out in stones on the chopper pad. So unlike in MASH the film, the conflict here in the TV series isn't a straightforward conflict against the war, because there are things about the war that the doctors will miss. Instead, the TV conflict is a conflict within the world of war. Because in this TV world, war isn't a single bad thing. It's two opposite things, good and bad. There are the pointless deaths, the heartbreak, the human cruelty and futility. But there are also the friendships and the daily triumphs, the hard-won moments of hope and joy and dignity. This conflict within the story world of the TV series creates a similar conflict within the main characters of the TV series. Instead of being simply alienated from the war, like the doctors of the film, the doctors of the TV series experience a bittersweet nostalgia. Even as BJ and Hawkeye look forward to San Francisco and clean clothes and real food, they also look back fondly on Korea and its month-old socks and lighter fluid martinis as the bad and the good of their military experience clashes within their hearts. So in other words, where the doctors of MASH the film are in conflict with the world of war, the characters in MASH the TV show are windows into the deeper conflict of the world. That's why at the end of the TV series, BJ and Hawkeye's final lines voice this conflict between the bad of war and the good. And it's also why, as we noted in our introductory lectures on character, BJ and Hawkeye and all of the other characters in MASH the TV show generate the specific cognitive effect we call sympathy. The inner essence of every TV character is the conflict of their story world. And when characters express an inner conflict, as we saw in our introductory lectures, they speak in soliloquies, and soliloquies generate sympathy. What makes the characters of TV shows different from each other is that they offer slightly different angles onto the story world's conflict, like different windows into the same room. So BJ is a little more reserved and pragmatic about the tragic comedy of war, while Hawkeye is a little more emotional. But the fact that all of the characters of a TV series offer windows into the same deep conflict means that they can always be swapped out and exchanged, like one pane of glass for another. This happens all the time in MASH when different episodes focus more on one main character than the others. But it also happens more dramatically when main characters are literally eliminated from the series for good. Over the 11 seasons of MASH, Trapper John is replaced by BJ Honeycutt, Colonel Henry Blake is replaced by Colonel Sherman Potter, Major Frank Burns is replaced by Major Charles Winchester III. Main characters can come and go like this in TV shows because the engine of the story is the deeper world conflict beneath them. The characters are just an opening for us to view it. The role of TV characters as windows into the more enduring conflict in the story world also means that antagonists work very differently in TV than in film. In film, the antagonist is the human face of the world that the hero fights against. In TV, the antagonist is instead an expression of the same world conflict that beats inside the hero's hearts. And so rather than simply encouraging negative feelings in the audience, most antagonists will, as the series progresses, inspire increasing amounts of sympathy. We can clearly see this difference between film and TV antagonists by turning to the antagonist's final scene in MASH the film and MASH the TV series. In MASH the film, the antagonist is Major Burns, an incompetent and repulsively smug doctor who endangers the lives of his patients and pompously bullies the other medical staff. Burns meets his end when he's humiliated by Hawkeye for his private relationship with Hot Lips. Hawkeye demands, "Is she better than self-abuse? Would you say that she was a moaner, Frank? Or does she lie there quiet and not do anything at all?" Burns responds to this attack by punching Hawkeye, leading Hawkeye to humiliate him further. "Frank Burns has gone nuts." Trapper John then yells, "Watch out for your goodies. The man is a sex maniac. I don't think Hot Lips satisfied him." At this point, Burns is shoved into a straitjacket and hauled away, prompting Duke to dryly complain, "Colonel, Fair's fair. If I nail Hot Lips and punch Hawkeye, can I go home? Everything about this scene is constructed to turn the audience against Burns. He's the face of the ugly and stupid world that the heroes of the film are fighting against, so we in the audience smirk at his destruction. In contrast, in the final episode of MASH, the TV show, the main antagonist is made an object of sympathy. This antagonist is Major Charles Winchester, the season 6 replacement for Frank Burns. In the final episode, after Winchester has tried to teach 5 Chinese POWs to play Mozart, he sees them loaded onto a truck. Rushing out, he's told that the POWs are being collected for a prisoner swap. Winchester desperately tries to stop the exchange. He's come so close to teaching the POWs to play Mozart. It's given him a ray of hope, and he can't bear to stop the lessons now. But Winchester is overruled, and the truck pulls away. And then, as Winchester looks on in despair, the Chinese musicians take out their instruments and play the Mozart exactly the way that Winchester had been trying to teach them. So as Winchester watches the musicians leave, his anguish melts away. And at the same time, the PA announces the end of the war, and everyone explodes with joy. The script, in other words, makes clear that Winchester's sense of happiness is shared by everyone. Instead of being in conflict with the main characters, Winchester feels exactly like them. If the show had stopped here, it would already be a massive departure from the original film. But the show then aligns Winchester even more profoundly with the other characters, because a few scenes later, Winchester is in the OR trying to save the final victims of the war when he comes upon a hopeless case, a patient missing half his chest. And then, to his horror, Winchester realizes that the patient is the Chinese flutist. In shock, Winchester says, "He wasn't even a soldier, he was a musician. What happened to the other people in the truck with him?" To which the corpsman replies, "He's the only one that made it this far." Winchester is shattered by this revelation, and he staggers out of the OR back to his tent. He puts on his record player, listening to a few bars of the Mozart he taught to the Chinese musicians, and then he grabs the record and smashes it in despair. Like Major Burns when he's dragged away in a straitjacket in the film, Winchester has just had the limits of his power crushingly exposed. And yet we're not smirking at Winchester like we smirked at Burns. We're feeling with him. Just as we felt his joy at the end of the war, now we feel his horror at its pointless destruction. And so in Winchester, we get the whole tragicomic experience of MASH, the TV show. He encapsulates both the joy and the heartbreak, the hard-earned victories and the brutal defeats. In other words, like all the characters in the TV series, Winchester soliloquizes the world's deep conflict, and so our hearts open up to him in sympathy. And this, in a nutshell, is the difference between antagonists in film and TV. In film, the antagonist is opposed by the main characters. In TV, the antagonist is one of the main characters, a window into the same conflict as everyone else. And so in TV, instead of hating the antagonists, we eventually come to identify with them too. So to convert MASH the film into MASH the TV show, the writers had to convert the conflict between the characters and the world of war into a conflict within the world of war, building a TV engine that created a rotating cast of sympathetic characters and hundreds of hours of new plots. So how did the writers of MASH do this? Well, the short answer is that they did what writers always do when writers launch a TV series. They wrote a special episode known as the pilot episode, which constructs the engine and gets the wheels turning. In our next lecture, we'll look in detail at how to build a TV pilot, but to round off our discussion of MASH and give you a first look at how pilots work, let's wrap this lecture by turning to the pilot for MASH and seeing how it establishes a conflict in its story world that generates a bittersweet sense of the entwined good and bad of war. MASH's pilot begins with a series of vignettes. Hawkeye and Trapper John drink martinis and play golf in a minefield. Hot Lips and Frank Burns read the Bible and the U.S. Army manual while they play footsie in bed. Commander Henry Blake works with surgical concentration to open a bottle of champagne. when suddenly the air rescue siren sounds and the PA blares, "Attention, all personnel, report immediately to admitting ward and operating room." So that's the pilot's two-step recipe for establishing the conflict of its story world. First, show a group of characters who embody both the good and the bad of wartime medicine. Second, bring them all together into the same operating room to save the same lives, so the audience sees the good and the bad of the war, entwined together as one. This is a great model for starting your own first pilot. Show little snippets of both sides of the conflict in your story world, cutting back and forth between your main heroes and your antagonists, before showing that in this world, both your heroes and your antagonists have to work together on the same mission to do the same thing. Having established this tragicomic story world, the pilot then begins to flesh out its characters, expanding them from the little comic contradictions of its opening vignettes into individuals who each offer their own perspective into the deeper conflict of the story world. The first character that the script introduces in depth is Hawkeye, and his introduction makes clear that unlike in the film, Hawkeye is not in conflict against the world of war. Instead, he's a window for the audience to see into the world and feel with it. The pilot accomplishes this task by giving Hawkeye a voiceover where he describes his job to his father. So this voiceover quite literally serves as a first-person window into Hawkeye's world, allowing us to see it through his eyes. And to introduce us to both sides of the tragicomic story world, Hawkeye's voiceover describes both the dark side and the bright side of his military experience. He's honest about the shortcomings of his job and admits he can sound callous. But he also sees his work as good and important. It helps save human lives. So Hawkeye, in other words, delivers a soliloquy that taps into the deep conflict of the story world, generating sympathy for Hawkeye, but also more deeply for the story world around him. And this is another simple technique you can try when writing your next pilot. After you've introduced the big conflict in your story world, introduce your first main character through a voiceover where he explores both the good and the bad of that conflict, generating a soliloquy that encourages the audience to identify with both that character and the world of the series as a whole. The plot of MASH's pilot is similarly reverse engineered to convey the experience of the story world's tragicomic conflict. Its main action is a scheme that Hawkeye concocts with Trapper John. And that scheme is to get their Korean houseboy, Ho John, the money he needs to go to college. And to pull off this scheme, the two doctors concoct a roguish plan to host a debauched party, raffle off a weekend with a nurse, and then rig the raffle. The plot, in short, is a tale of doing good by doing bad. Like everything in the war, it's a mixture of the bitter and the sweet. And finally, the pilot's ending is also built to reinforce the show's tragicomic cognitive effect. At the end of the pilot, Hawkeye's plan seems to be ruined by a general who tries to send him home immediately. But then, the general witnesses Hawkeye operate and reverses his earlier decision.
He was too impressed to have you arrested.
We did it again. Screwed up in reverse.
I keep telling you, we gotta give up this preoccupation with keeping people alive or we'll never get out of here.
So even though the general seems like a bad guy, the pilot reveals that he isn't. Like everyone in the war, the general sees that the good always comes mixed with the bad, and so he pardons the doctor's bad behavior to preserve their good surgical skills. This moment in the pilot is in direct contrast to the film, where after Hawkeye performs an unauthorized operation on a child, he's charged by the hospital's commander for misusing Army resources and is forced to blackmail the commander to escape. So the TV pilot breaks sharply with the film by culminating in a moment where both Hawkeye and his antagonist become faces of the same world. In doing so, it once again establishes that the TV series will be about a conflict within that story world, and the characters will all be windows into it. In our lecture on Game of Thrones, we'll explore the structure of pilots more deeply, and in the next 3 lectures after that, we'll analyze 3 other major genres of contemporary TV scripts, giving you blueprints for writing cable serials, network procedurals, primetime soaps, and sitcoms. But the big screenwriting lesson from this lecture is that the pilots of all TV scripts, whether they're sitcoms or soaps, procedurals or dramas, work tirelessly to establish the show's engine. And they do that by establishing a deep conflict in the story world, by introducing all the main characters, including the antagonists, as windows into that conflict, and by using all the story beats of the plot from beginning to end to provide viewers with a consistent cognitive experience of that conflict. Because what makes TV writing special is its consistency. The real world may toss and change and flip us upside down, but in TV we can find a world that goes on and on the same, offering an anchor and a respite from the storm. If you'd like to get started on the transition from film scripts to TV, here's a couple of exercises you can try. First, plan the adaptation of one of your favorite movies into a TV show. Identify the movie's conflict between character and story world and translate it into a conflict within just the story world. Then adapt or create a group of characters who inhabit that conflicted world and offer a window into it. Second, write an opening scene for your TV pilot that follows the model of MASH. Introduce your main characters, including your antagonists, in groups of 2 through a series of short opening vignettes. And then bring them together in a single place or event that embodies the core conflict of the world. And there you go. You've just built your first TV engine. So let's say you've got an idea for a clever new TV series. Maybe it's an innovative spin on a tried and tested TV genre. Or maybe it's a slice of life that's never been broadcast before. So how do you turn your smart idea into an actual TV series? How do you launch the next Sopranos, or 30 Rock, or Law and Order? Well, the first thing you do is write the pilot. Most immediately, the pilot is the first episode, the one that starts the series. But the pilot is much more than that. It's also the episode that establishes the show's engine, ensuring that the show not only starts, but runs and runs and runs, episode after episode, season after season, for dozens and even hundreds of hours, all the way to the end. That's the real goal of a pilot episode, to build the engine, so that the show doesn't just begin, it finishes too. The most straightforward way to understand a TV engine is as a deep conflict in the story world. In MASH, that conflict is between the inhumanity of war and the human virtues it inspires. In Law and Order, that conflict is between the ordered procedures of the American justice system and the chaos that confronts it. In The Sopranos, that conflict is between respect and love. One comes from projecting strength, the other from admitting vulnerability. In every sitcom, that conflict is between being our own person and being part of a bigger friend or family group. Do I want to be like me, just the way I like to be? Or do I want to be with you, how you need me to be? In Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, that conflict is the one that rages in every adolescent heart. Do I want to be free to enjoy the same irresponsible teen activities as all my friends? Or do I want to live up to parental expectations and save the world? Because every TV series has its own special engine, the first step in writing your pilot is deciding what kind of engine you want to build. We'll explore a variety of different engines in this lecture and in the next 3. And there are lots of other engines out there on TV and in your imagination. Each of these engines comes in their own range of formats. Network sitcoms have the shortest format at around 22 minutes. Then there are network procedurals, which clock in around 45 minutes. And then there are cable serial dramas, which might be a full hour or more. Some shows have commercial breaks. Some shows don't. That's why when you're writing a pilot, it helps to be clear on what network you're targeting. Which one seems like a good home for your show? What's the typical format for its shows? How many commercial breaks do they have? How long is the action between commercials? So like everything else in screenwriting, you start with your goal and reverse engineer back. But even within the wide range of network options, all pilots have one thing in common. All pilots establish their engines relentlessly. Through their beginnings, their endings, their character introductions, their plots, and their tones, pilots return again and again to the central conflict of their story world. This gives the audience an honest taste of what's to come. If they like the experience of the pilot, the show is built to keep delivering. And it also establishes that the engine can really work. Because if it can generate different characters, an engaging plot, and a powerful ending scene, then the conflict in the story world is deep and compelling enough to generate many, many hours of television. To give you a blueprint for how pilots establish their engines from beginning to end through plot and character and tone, we'll focus in this lecture on the pilot for Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones has won dozens of Emmys and become the gold standard for cable serial drama, which is the TV format that gets the most respect from screenwriters. Everybody wants their own show on HBO. And since Game of Thrones' fourth season, it's surpassed The Sopranos as the most watched HBO show of all time. So you can't make other writers more envious than that. But we're not just going to study the pilot of Game of Thrones because it's been a huge success. We're also going to study it because it failed. When the pilot was first shot, it bombed. Test audiences hated it, and the show's own producers called it a, quote, massive problem. It was only after the pilot was restructured that it became an epic hit. So by looking at the difference between the failed pilot and the successful one, we will zero in precisely on what the successful pilot did right. We won't go through all the changes, but we'll touch on a few representative ones to give you a sense of their overall purpose. And as you can perhaps already guess, that purpose is simple: to relentlessly establish the engine. To analyze Game of Thrones, we'll do what we always do when we analyze a script and reverse engineer back from the ending. The ending is where the pilot opens up to full throttle, establishing the cognitive effect that'll be the hallmark of subsequent episodes. So whenever you want to understand how a particular TV series works, turn to the final beats of its pilot. There you'll find the show's cognitive effect loud and clear, allowing you to reverse engineer the series' unique engine. So now let's reverse engineer Game of Thrones by isolating the cognitive effect of the end of its pilot, which means that if you haven't watched the pilot episode or read the script yet, now's the time to hit pause and go enjoy it. The pilot for Game of Thrones introduces us to the fantasy realm of Westeros, a violent place of political machinations and dynastic struggles based loosely on the War of the Roses of 15th century England. And at the end of the pilot, 10-year-old Bran begins to climb a tower in the northern castle he calls home. It's a difficult and dangerous climb. One mistake and he'll fall to his death. But Bran keeps going higher and higher, leaving the ground far behind, when suddenly he hears a woman moaning softly, and he realizes that something curious is happening inside the tower. Bran looks in the window and sees a man and a woman in a carnal embrace. The man's face is hidden, and Bran peers closer until the faces of the man and the woman come into view, revealing them to be Jaime and Cersei, the queen and her twin brother. And this is their terrible secret. They're in an incestuously adulterous relationship. At this point, Cersei catches sight of Bran, and she's horrified. In a panic, she insists that her brother do something to bury their dark secret. But Jaime instead asks Bran his age. 10, Bran replies. And Jaime repeats it. 10. Jaime turns away from the window, and Bran exhales, relieved to have escaped. When abruptly, Jaime sighs, "The things I do for love." And he casually shoves Bran out the window, sending the 10-year-old boy down, down, down to his demise. That's the final scene. So what's the cognitive effect of watching it? Well, the cognitive effect is of the destruction of innocence. Bran wants to know what's going on inside the tower. He wants to peer inside its dark secrets. And the knowledge shatters him, literally. And the same holds true for us, the audience. We want to know. We want to find out the shadowy mysteries of this curious story world. And the answer shatters us. Or more precisely, it shatters the child in us. That's the core cognitive experience of Game of Thrones. It fills us with a morbid curiosity to know the dark secrets of its story world. But the more we learn, the more we suffer, experiencing the pain of losing our innocence. So what's the story engine that drives this experience? What's the conflict behind it? Well, the conflict is a painful contradiction in the nature of power. Power brings us pleasure, but power also destroys us. Take the royal authority wielded by the king of Westeros. As the pilot ruthlessly makes clear, that power has both gratified the king and destroyed him. Here's how the king himself puts it. I eat, drink, and whore my way to an early grave. So power has ruined the king by giving him everything that he wants. And in Game of Thrones, there's an even deeper kind of power than royal authority. That power is knowledge. To know other people's secrets is to control them. To know the ways of the world is to master it. And it's not just the characters of the show who can participate in this knowledge. We, the audience, can participate too. And that's why the show is constantly filling us, the audience, with a hunger to know. That knowledge makes us feel powerful, but it also wounds us, breaking our innocence. So there you go. That's the core engine of Game of Thrones, a conflict between the two faces of power, enticement and punishment, carefully established in the pilot's final beats. So to learn how the rest of the pilot is built, let's now see how it establishes this engine through its other core story components, beginning with the opening teaser where the pilot first establishes the engine. The pilot opens with 3 rangers leaving the wall for the wilderness beyond. Out in the snowy woods, they find a campsite of mutilated bodies arranged in an eerily irregular pattern, leading one of the rangers to declare that no human did this. The killer must be something else. Making us wonder, what strange something could that be? What does the strange pattern of corpses mean? So you can see that the pilot's first move is to offer up an eerie mystery. Like Bran when he climbs the tower, it offers us a glimpse of something odd, making us want to know what's behind it. And then the scene promptly deepens the mystery because the bodies in the snow abruptly disappear. All that remains is a little scrap of red cloth in the snow. And as we focus in on the scrap of cloth, thinking that it must hold the answer to what's going on with the bodies, a shadowy creature with piercing blue eyes appears and decapitates 2 rangers, casually tossing one of their heads to the last survivor. And in an instant, we go from being curious to feeling our heart race in fear, just like Bran when he peers through the window of the tower. So this opening scene encapsulates in miniature the double experience of all of Game of Thrones. First, the scene creates a deepening sense of mystery, channeling our attention into finding the answer. Just as Bran is focused on making out the figures in the tower, we focus on the scrap of red cloth. This little clue holds out the promise of knowledge and the pleasure of having the answers. But then suddenly, the script surprises us. We were so focused on solving the mystery that we didn't see the real answer coming from the side. And as the monster pounces, we feel a jolt of terror. We go from one face of power to the other, out of the pleasure into the pain. If you compare the successful Game of Thrones pilot with the failed pilot, you'll see that the failed pilot doesn't make this double move as effectively. In the successful pilot, Will's first line is, "I've never seen wildlings do a thing like this. I've never seen a thing like this, not ever in my life." In the failed pilot, Will's first line is, "We should start back. They're all dead." Compare those again. "I've never seen a thing like this, not ever in my life," and "We should start back. They're all dead." The successful pilot immediately builds a sense of dark and enormous mystery. The failed pilot begins by telling us it's all wrapped up, so it doesn't entice us in the same way. The point here is not that you should begin every pilot with a seductive mystery that ends with a jolt. That's the wrong move for most pilots because most pilots are trying to achieve a different psychological experience than Game of Thrones. But this intriguing seduction into pain is exactly the right move for Game of Thrones because it perfectly establishes the core cognitive effect that drives the whole series. It makes you want to know, and then it makes you suffer for it. From here, the pilot then introduces a series of characters, all of whom get a generous chunk of screen time, and all of whom are presented as important. This sequential introduction of characters is a hallmark of almost every pilot, whether it's a sitcom or a procedural or a serial drama. Pilots need 3 or 4 or 5 or more main characters. And that's because even TV shows that seem to be focused on one main character are really using that character as a window into a bigger story world. And for a story world to exist, it needs to be peopled. Otherwise, it quickly comes to seem flat. Because pilots introduce a lot of characters, the danger is that the pilot's plot can start to feel confusing and overwhelming, like walking into a party and suddenly being introduced to a whole bunch of strangers at once. So there are 2 keys to making these sequential character introductions. First, each character should be introduced as a window into some part of the underlying conflict in the story world. Each character should offer their own different angle on this conflict, responding to it differently and emphasizing one side of the conflict more than the other. But even so, beneath these different angles and points of emphasis, the characters should all be reflections of the same conflict in the story world, the same deep engine that drives the series. This makes the individual characters feel like part of a coherent whole, so that instead of bouncing us through a series of random introductions, the script makes us feel more and more familiar with the single, larger story world that connects everyone. Second, the first 2 main character introductions should introduce characters who are in conflict with each other. In other words, the first main character should embody more of one side of the story world conflict, and the second main character should embody more of the other side. This reinforces the conflict in the story world and sets in motion a plot that draws the main characters into relationship with each other. So let's see how these 2 key techniques cash out in the pilot to Game of Thrones. The first set of characters to be introduced are the Starks. All the Starks are a little different, but the general tone is set with Bran. Bran is introduced trying to learn archery, and instead being humiliated by the superior skill of his sister. The pilot, in other words, shows Bran in a place of inexperience, and in trying to gain more worldly know-how, Bran gets his legs taken out from under him. So perfectly, concisely, the script establishes Bran as a window into the story world's central conflict. Bran wants to learn, and he suffers for it. The script then repeats this move at more length in Bran's first extended scene, where we look through Bran's eyes as he witnesses the execution of the surviving ranger. Bran's mother worries that he's too young to see such things, but Bran's father insists that it'll be educational for Bran to see someone die. So once again, the script reminds us that in this world, knowledge is power. For Bran to ascend in the world, he must learn what death looks like. And so Bran forces himself to watch when his father beheads the ranger. But in gaining this knowledge of what death looks like, Bran also discovers the other, less happy side of power. It's jolting to watch the end of a man's life. And so as Bran learns, he simultaneously suffers as part of his innocence dies. So there you see how the script introduces its first main character as a window into the story world. What makes Bran distinct is not that he has his own unique conflict. It's that he occupies a special place in that bigger conflict of the story world. That conflict spans from an inexperienced curiosity on one side to an experienced suffering on the other. That is, from the innocent part of us that's seduced by power to the jaded part of us that is ruined by power. Bran is clearly on the side of inexperience. There's still a lot for him to know. He's only begun to suffer. And because Bran is our window into his family, the broader effect of his introduction is to establish the Starks as inexperienced. They're from the north. They're outside the main channels of power. No matter how knowing Bran's father may pretend to be, he's not that different from his son, because he's also got to learn about the darker secrets of the world. So that's the first technique for establishing characters in a pilot. Make your characters clear expressions of the underlying world conflict. And here's the second technique. introduced the second main character on the opposite side of the story world conflict from the first main character. In the Game of Thrones pilot, the next main character we see is the Lannister twins, Cersei and Jaime. I know, they're actually two characters, but in the same way that the pilot treats the Starks as a single inexperienced character, it treats the Lannister twins as a single entity. As the episodes move along, the characters will distinguish themselves more and more. But at the beginning, they have to be lumped together in groups to keep things comprehensible for the audience's minds. In the pilot, the Lannister twins are introduced as they watch the funeral procession of the king's former right-hand man, prompting Cersei to fret that the old man told someone before he died. To which Cersei's brother responds, "If he told the king, both our heads would be skewered on the city gates by now." So the script introduces the Lannisters as the keepers of a terrible secret. And by doing so, the pilot reinforces its engine in two ways. First, it establishes the Lannisters, like Bran and all the other characters, as windows into the world's central conflict. The Lannisters have knowledge, which is power, but also the thing that's going to get them killed. And this, of course, triggers another bout of morbid curiosity in us, the audience. What's the awful thing the Lannisters are hiding? We feel compelled to know, just like Bran feels compelled to watch the Ranger die. Second, by introducing the Lannisters as the keepers of a dark secret, the pilot establishes a conflict between the Lannisters and the Starks that will fuel the show's engine. The Starks, as we've seen, are inexperienced. They're outside power. The Lannisters are the opposite. They're at the center of power. They know the fullness of its pleasures. And like the king, they've suffered deeply for it. Their innocence is gone. Their 10-year-old selves have long ago been destroyed. This conflict between the inexperience of the Starks and the deep experience of the Lannisters sets in motion the driving action that will become the story of the pilot, and beyond that, the story of the first season. And that story is the efforts of the Starks to learn the Lannisters' secret, while the Lannisters battle back, trying to keep their private knowledge, and with it, their power. This is why you want to use your first two main character introductions to establish characters who are on opposite sides of the world conflict. This creates a battle of wills between characters that serves as a physical embodiment of your story engine, drawing in audiences and driving forward your main storyline. So now, let's see how that main storyline plays out in the pilot's plot. The pilot, as we've just seen, is driven by a conflict between the Starks' drive to know and the Lannisters' efforts to conceal. And in keeping with the method of reverse engineering, the pilot builds its plot backwards to maximize this conflict. The way to maximize the conflict is, naturally, to get the mightiest Stark as close as possible to the thing that the Lannisters most want to hide. So we want our pilot to position the most powerful secret seeker right up against the most powerful secret keeper. Which is to say, the overall goal of the plot is to insert Ned Stark into the heart of the king's palace. How does a pilot do this? Well, it starts by getting rid of the king's right-hand man. This gives the king an excuse to invite Ned to become the new right hand, where he'll be immersed in the dark shadows of the court. And that's why the first thing the pilot does after introducing the Starks is to show us the funeral of the king's right-hand man, providing the king with a reason to seek out Ned Stark and invite him to court. The next step of the plot is for the king to make his formal request by visiting Ned. This brings the Lannisters into the Starks' home, so it gives the audience a taste of the bigger conflict that will come when the Starks get into the Lannisters' lair. And the final big step of the plot comes just before Ned Stark leaves to journey to the palace. Here, the script introduces a little scene where Ned's wife reads a note from her sister, informing Ned that the king's right-hand man was murdered by the Lannisters. This scene is crucial because it ramps up the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters by giving Ned a reason to pry into Cersei and Jaime's affairs. The Lannisters will be actively hiding something. The Starks will be actively hunting it. So those are the big strokes of the main storyline. But there's one other key part of the plot, and that's the scenes set over the sea in Essos. These scenes are by far the most shocking and bizarre ones in the plot, and they're in fact so shocking and bizarre that they caused the original pilot to bomb. That's because in the original pilot, these scenes were introduced right after the initial scenes with the Starks, which was a catastrophic but understandable mistake for the writers to make. It's an understandable mistake because it seems a logical way to establish the three-part geography of the story world. First, you show the White Walkers in the land north of the Wall, then you show the Starks in the land of Westeros, and then you show the lands across the sea in Essos, which is in fact exactly the way it works in the novel on which the pilot is based. The prologue introduces the land north of the Wall, chapters 1 and 2 introduce the Starks and Westeros, and chapter 3 introduces Daenerys in Essos. The Lannisters don't show up until chapter 4. But pilots are not novels. The mechanics are very different. And when the failed pilot followed the novel and introduces the scenes in Essos before it introduced the Lannisters, it set itself up for disaster. Because it didn't accomplish the boom boom of the Starks then the Lannisters that reinforces the engine and establishes the deeper conflict in the story world that ties together all the different characters in a common struggle. Instead, the failed pilot introduced what seemed like another random set of characters in another random place, causing test audiences to lose interest and tune out. So in the later successful pilot, the writers departed from the structure of the novel and delayed the introduction of Essos. They waited until after they had established the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters, and after the king had asked Ned Stark back to his palace. And in its new location, this scene about the weird goings-ons of Essos performs a crucial function. It reminds the audience that the world of Game of Thrones extends beyond Westeros into many strange places that raise their own curious questions. Who are the White Walkers? What do the people of Essos want? And what's with the dragons? In other words, the delayed introduction of Essos intensifies the sense of morbid curiosity that was sparked in the opening scene in the snow and that culminates in the tower scene. What had jammed up the engine in the failed pilot now works to accelerate it. The big lesson here is that the world of a TV show is not its geographical places. It's its core conflict. So to establish the story world, don't rush into showing all of its physical locales. Instead, focus on establishing the deeper world conflict by showing two main characters in opposition. In TV, you can expand your plot and your numbers of characters and your physical geography as much as you want. But you have to establish the engine that drives them first. Now let's turn briefly to the tone. As we discussed earlier, the tone of a pilot is engineered to intensify the audience's experience of the core conflict. And that's exactly what the tone of Game of Thrones does. It's visually enticing, filled with mysterious and intriguing objects like dragon's eggs and beautiful nude bodies wreathed in shadow. And it's also filled with a constant patter of secrets, like when Ned remarks, "I don't fight in tournaments because when I fight a man for real, I don't want him to know what I can do." So the how and the what of the tone is engineered to draw us, the viewers, into the trap of curiosity, whispering of new things for us to see. Because we never learn. Let's flesh out our blueprint for Game of Thrones by examining a few of the pilot scenes in more granular detail. And to deepen our understanding of what makes the pilot's engine work, let's look specifically at what made it fail, contrasting the scenes where the failed pilot and the successful pilot introduced the most legendary character of the series, Tyrion. The failed pilot introduces Tyrion as he receives, to quote the actual words of the script, oral pleasure from a red-headed whore. Which is to say, the failed pilot creates absolutely no sense of mystery. It's unsubtle, frank, and gross. The successful pilot instead introduces Tyrion through a little scene where Catelyn lays out candles for his bedroom because she's heard he likes to read all night. To which Luwin retorts that he's heard that Tyrion drinks all night. To which a surprised Caitlin replies that even if Tyrion does drink all night, surely a man of his stature couldn't possibly consume the 8 barrels of ale that Lewin has just brought up from the cellars. So this revised scene works because it immediately establishes the core engine of the pilot, a sense of dark secrets. Who is Tyrion? Is he a reader or a drinker? And what's the deal with his stature? Then when we do actually meet Tyrion and the amorous redhead in the successful pilot, Tyrion yells for the door to be closed, preserving a sense that something remains hidden. And finally, the pilot drives home Tyrion's character in a marvelous moment where Tyrion declares to Jon the Bastard, "Let me give you some advice, bastard. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor. Then it can never be used to hurt you." Here again is the core conflict of the world. Tyrion has gained knowledge through suffering, and it reveals that Tyrion is himself a conflicted man. He wishes the world were otherwise. He's been hurt by its cruelty too, but he also knows that he has to make the best of the nightmare that he's been born into. By articulating this inner conflict, Tyrion generates sympathy, which, as we discussed in our last lecture, becomes permeated through all of the characters of a TV show, even the antagonists. Because we don't just feel for the world, we feel with it. So that's how the successful pilot changed its scenes with Tyrion. The failed pilot treated Tyrion more like the antagonist of a film, making him more unlikable and direct. The successful pilot made Tyrion a reflection of its engine, making him mysterious, conflicted, and sympathetic. So that's how you build a pilot. Come up with a clear, deep conflict in a story world. That's your engine. Then establish that conflict through your opening scene, through the introduction of your first 2 main characters, through the subsequent plot, through the introduction of later characters, and through the what and how of the tone. And finish by ramping up the conflict in the pilot's last scene. In other words, build a single story engine and then open the throttle, allowing it to generate all the characters in the story. Because in TV, a solidly built pilot engine is everything. The more fuel you feed it, the more seasons it'll go. And whenever things break down, it'll show you how to make repairs. This is how Game of Thrones became the biggest TV series of its time. After the first pilot tanked, the writers didn't flounder around randomly trying this or trying that. They knew how to troubleshoot because they had a clear engine in mind. So when they took the pilot back into the garage, they made just the right tweaks to get it up and humming. And that's the deep secret to launching your own Game of Thrones. Engine, engine, engine. So go write a show that rules the world. Because hey, what could power cost you? If you'd like to start writing your own original pilot, here's a 2-part exercise you can try. First, create your engine. Invent a deep conflict that's bigger than any one person, a conflict that inheres inside a story world. Second, write a short scene that brings together 2 characters on opposite sides of this conflict, so we can see both sides of the story world and get the big first season plotline started. Today, we're going to learn how to write a sitcom, which means we're going to learn how to be funny. I know, you're thinking one of 2 things. You're either thinking you're already funny, or you're thinking that you can never be funny at all. Don't kid yourself. No one is that funny. And no one can never be funny. All of us are a little funny because everybody is a little weird, and a little weird is the secret recipe for funny. That's where we get the word funny from. When you say that you've got a funny feeling about something, that means you find it a little odd. And this feeling of something strange is the hook that draws our brain towards humor. Because another way to say something is strange is to say that it's curious. And when you find something curious, you're intrigued. You want to pause and get a better look. But weirdness isn't the only ingredient to being funny. Because when your brain sees someone acting weird, it can go one of two ways. The first way is for your brain to decide that the strange behavior is a threat, at which point your skin starts to crawl. Weird things that menace are the secret to writing horror like Stephen King and Mary Shelley. And it's also why aggressive joke tellers or certain kinds of humor that seem to go too far can make you feel awkward and uncomfortable. The other way your brain can go is to decide that the weird person is harmless, at which point it'll encourage you to smile and maybe even laugh. Because your brain loves the company of people who are a little different. Different people can teach you new perspectives and grow the possibilities for your life. And so your brain uses laughter to shake out your social anxiety and bond with your new, unusual friend. So to make people laugh, you just have to do two things. The first is to locate your inner oddball. This is the key to being funny if you don't think you're funny at all. Just hone in on your quirks and eccentricities and play them up a little. Because we've all got our quirks and eccentricities. If you think you don't, your friends must be saints because they're too nice to tell you. The second thing to do is to make sure that people know you're harmless. This is the key to being funny if you know you're funny already, but people mostly stare or back away or laugh nervously. To turn their anxious looks into smiles, just dial your intensity back a bit so that they know you're not about to get hostile. If you make sure that your weirdness isn't threatening, people will laugh every time. I guarantee it, and I should know. People are always laughing at me. See what I did there? I was self-deprecating. I made fun of myself, which made me seem harmless. And that's why self-deprecating humor is the surest way to make people laugh. If you tease someone or joke at their expense, you can make them feel threatened, which is when the weird becomes upsetting. But if you joke at your own expense, you're only a threat to yourself, so the weird becomes funny to everybody else. By learning to be funny, you take the first big step toward writing a sitcom. All that's left to do is add a little structure and a few characters who are all harmlessly odd in their own way. And in this lecture, we'll learn how to do that. This lecture will be the first of 3 where we explore a specific genre of TV writing. Up to this point, we've been treating TV shows like each one is its own special snowflake, and to a certain extent, they are. No matter how much a TV show borrows from earlier shows, it always does something new to modify the engine. Otherwise, we'd feel like we'd seen it before, and while a little familiarity is good in TV, too much is the essence of boredom. But even though every show has its own special engine, there are a number of TV genres that share many of the same pistons and cogs. You can think of them as families of similar engines, all with their own little tweaks and modifications, but all derived from the same original blueprint. In this lecture and the following 2, we'll explore the 3 most popular of these family affairs: the sitcom, the procedural, and the soap opera. We're starting with the sitcom because its script blueprint is the most ancient, going back thousands of years to the time of Alexander the Great and the new comedies of Greece. This doesn't mean that there isn't room for innovation. If you want to change the blueprint, you can. But the basic blueprint has worked for centuries, so you can rely on it to work for you. Take, for example, Seinfeld, which is often hailed as the most innovative sitcom of the late 20th century. Seinfeld's innovation is that it's a show about nothing. Which is to say that in every episode, the characters of Seinfeld become obsessed with something totally meaningless. Jerry frets over the size of his girlfriend's hands. Kramer doesn't like his shower head. George decides to do everything backwards. Elaine fixates on poppy seeds. Then all the characters get together and hold a big contest to see who can do nothing to themselves the longest. So, over each episode of Seinfeld, the characters' trivial obsessions snowball into greater and greater absurdity until, at the end, everything goes back to normal. It was much ado about nothing. But really, Seinfeld's emphasis on nothing isn't an innovation at all. As we saw back in our introductory lectures, every ancient Greek and Roman new comedy starts with an insignificant problem that the characters make for themselves. Sometimes the characters become fixated on something trivial. Sometimes they hatch a whimsical scheme. Sometimes they get caught in a lie or a cheat. Whatever it is, it's nothing. And although the nothing becomes a bigger and bigger source of chaos and absurdity, the more the character refuses to give in, its nothingness is always confirmed at the end of the comedy when the character relents and everything goes back to normal. So it was all much ado about nothing. This basic model of a nothing problem goes all the way back to the earliest American sitcoms, when they began making the leap from radio to TV in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Of these early sitcoms, the most famous is I Love Lucy, which is an absolute gem. Just like the old comedies of Greece and Rome, every episode of I Love Lucy begins with a problem that the characters create for themselves. Like the time that Lucy decides the best way to pay off her bills is to participate in a quiz show stunt where she tells her husband Ricky that she was already married. Or the time that Ricky creates a problem for himself when he decides to put Lucy on a strict schedule, prompting her to march him and his boss through a dinner party where there's no time to talk or eat or defrost the food. And just like in the old comedies of Greece and Rome, the basic plots of I Love Lucy elaborate their initial nothing problem into more and more self-inflicted disasters until, at the end, the rogue character finally gives up and all the problems dissolve. So in Season 1, Episode 16, Lucy Fakes an Illness, Lucy quite literally makes up a problem, an illness that she feigns as a way of getting her husband to let her audition for his show. But Lucy's husband soon discovers she's faking, and to teach her a lesson, he gets an actor to play a doctor and tell Lucy that she does in fact have a terminal illness, convincing Lucy that she's really going to die. But the episode doesn't end with Lucy's actual demise. Instead, the doctor is revealed to be a fraud, and so the fatal sickness dissolves back into the nothing from whence it came, at which point everything goes back to normal. So there's the classic sitcom structure. First, a nothing problem is created, then the problem snowballs, creating more and more disasters, and finally, since the problem is entirely made up, the characters all forget it at the end and it goes entirely away. Much ado about nothing. But there's a little more to the modern sitcom than just this ancient story structure, and so to fill out our blueprint with a few more key details, we'll use the rest of this lecture to reverse engineer the characters, the tone, and the other elements of the longest-running American sitcom of all time. I'm speaking, of course, of The Simpsons. In addition to being the most successful sitcom ever, The Simpsons is also really clever. It's won 32 Emmys, which is more than Seinfeld, or The Mary Tyler Moore Show, or even Cheers. And like a lot of sitcoms, The Simpsons took some time to hit its stride, so we won't look at the pilot. Instead, we'll do a popular episode from the show's prime in Season 4. That episode is Duffless, where Homer tries to give up alcohol and Lisa tries to win the science fair. If you haven't seen it yet or read the script, go give it a whirl. You'll find it funny, I promise. I did after someone explained the jokes to me. To reverse engineer the Simpsons engine, let's start by doing what we do with all TV scripts and identify the cognitive effect of the ending as precisely as we can. Duffless ends when Homer leaves his drinking buddies to go on a date with Marge. And as Homer rides off into the sunset with Marge on the handlebars of his little bicycle, he rings the bike's bell and chortles. So here you have the basic cognitive experience of every episode of every modern sitcom. Or rather, the two married experiences of every episode of every modern sitcom. The first is the experience of togetherness. Homer and Marge are united again. The second is the experience of personal kookiness. Homer can't pedal off into his happily ever after without indulging in a little private joke. He has to ring the bell and giggle, even though his wife does not find it funny at all. These two opposite feelings of comic individuality and sentimental togetherness point us to the engine that makes The Simpsons and pretty much every other modern sitcom go. That sitcom engine is the conflict between the individual and the society. Now, a lot of shows involve conflicts between individuals and their society, but the sitcom puts its own peculiar stamp on this conflict in two ways. First, it treats the term individual literally. In the world of the sitcom, every individual is a one-of-a-kind freak. Every character is filled with rogue desires and dreams. The deeper you dig into their psyches, the more weirdly singular they seem. And second, the sitcom treats the term society literally too. In a sitcom, society isn't just a group of people. It's social in the profound sense of really wanting the best for everyone. So unlike in tragedies or heroic dramas or other kinds of stories that hinge on a conflict between the one and the many, sitcoms don't ally with one side or the other. Instead, sitcoms celebrate our inner bizarre while also championing the greater good. From the perspective of the sitcom, our individual quirks and our social togetherness are both essential to a happy life. But like an odd couple, our quirks and our togetherness just can't seem to get along. Because all sitcoms use this basic engine, they all encourage the same two cognitive experiences. They make us laugh at the singular and smile warmly at the social. So we're either chuckling at a character's odd behavior, like when Homer rings his little bell, or tenderly enjoying a moment of togetherness, like when Homer and Marge ride off into their sunset. But that's not to say that all sitcoms are the same. They generate enormous variety by tweaking the specific characteristics of the individual and the social. In Frasier, the tweak is that the individuals are highly neurotic psychiatrists. In Cheers, the tweak is that the society is a bar where everyone is trying to escape the other society outside. So in other words, there are two basic ways to invent your own original sitcom. The first is to focus on a unique subculture of individuals, like Fresh Off the Boat does with Taiwanese Americans, or Broad City does with female college grads in New York City. The second is to focus on a unique kind of social togetherness, like Modern Family does with post-divorce American families, or Community does with study groups, or Seinfeld does with the special bond between misanthropes. Since the engine of sitcoms is the running conflict between the individual and the society, sitcoms never imply that one is absolutely better than the other. If they did, that would kill the engine. Instead, sitcom episodes go back and forth between mocking the individual from the perspective of the society and mocking the society from the perspective of the individual. So, in our episode of The Simpsons, one of the many mocks of individuals is when Police Chief Wiggum terrifies Marge by telling her that Homer is DOA, only to then chuckle and say, "Oh, I always mess up DOA with DWI." Clearly, in this case, the police chief is the one who's the menace to society. But there are also many, many moments where the reverse happens and the society is the menace to the individual. For example, when all the students at Lisa's school hoot and cheer when the tomato that would end world hunger is instead used as a projectile to slime the school principal. In The Simpsons, the character who voices the views of the society is frequently Marge. But this role rotates around different characters, as is always the case in TV. At times, even Homer can be the wise social guru, like when he tries to stop Barney from driving drunk. So the key to a successful sitcom script is to keep the engine going by never picking sides in the conflict and by allowing all the characters to rotate their roles. Sometimes the individual is the source of the madness, sometimes the society is the source of the madness, and every character gets to switch between being the voice of social reason and being the voice of social resistance. Now that we've uncovered the basic engine of the sitcom, let's see how it drives the opening scene, the characters, the tone, and the nothing problem plot of Duffless. Duffless opens on a dream. It's Bart's dream, and in it he invents a go-go ray to make all the teachers dance. This is the quintessential sitcom opener. Not because every sitcom should open with a literal dream, but because the starting point for most sitcom episodes is a figurative dream where one or more characters is caught in their own private world, lost in their own delusional desires or schemes or obsessions. And that's why after Bart physically wakes up, the episode goes on to show the other members of Bart's family as they remain psychically marooned in their own waking dreams. When Homer is asked to help Lisa on her science fair project, he responds, "Yeah, syrup is better than jelly." Meanwhile, Lisa announces that she's grown a futuristic tomato by fertilizing it with anabolic steroids. This is another kind of dream, in the way that Martin Luther King would have had a dream if he was a rampant, mad scientist narcissist. Because in Lisa's daydream, a third world family has erected a shrine to her, worshiping her as their tomato savior. So the real point of Lisa's invention isn't so much to improve other people's lives as to improve her own celebrity. Like Bart's Go-Go Ray fantasy, Lisa's dream is really all about her. The two dreams that the episode introduces in this beginning scene are the ones that will drive the remaining plot. Homer's dreamy immersion in his own gut appetites brings him into opposition with Marge, creating a conflict that will lead to his extravagant efforts to give up beer, while Lisa's dream of scientific glory will lead to her equally extravagant efforts to turn Bart into her lab rat. And that's almost always how the openings of sitcom episodes work. They establish the offbeat individual dream or dreams that launch the ensuing character conflicts of the plot. So now that we've seen how the episode begins, let's look at how it builds its characters. Or to use the technical literary term for sitcom characters, let's see how the episode builds its clowns. Not a clown in the narrow sense of someone with face paint and big red shoes, although The Simpsons does have one of those. But a clown in the broader literary sense of any character locked within his own private worldview. Any character, that is, who mistakes his dreams for reality. This mistake is a kind of madness. Do it too much and you get locked up. But the thing about clowns is that they don't think they're mad. They think that everyone else is nuts. And so instead of changing or softening their views, clowns charge more and more forcibly ahead, crashing headlong into everyone around. There are many different ways to create a sitcom clown. One way that goes back to the ancients is to give the clown an uncontrollably strong emotion or passion. On the ancient stage, old men were all wildly jealous, young men were all wildly amorous, middle-aged fathers were all wildly angry, and so on. And in The Simpsons, you can see vestiges of this ancient clown recipe in the moments where the middle-aged Homer violently strangles his children. Another technique for clown making that also goes back to the ancients is to make the clown a professional stereotype. So for example, all the soldier clowns in ancient comedies are cowards, while all the courtesan clowns are crafty. You can see vestiges of this ancient technique in The Simpsons' lazy cops, its ineffectually pompous school principal, and its glibly dishonest lawyer. And you can also go beyond the ancients and make the weirdness of your clowns more deeply personal. So in this episode of The Simpsons, Chief Wiggum makes himself videos of himself in a splash pool. Lisa decides that the key food for ending world hunger is a tomato. Bart teaches a hamster to fly. This is genuine kook, a step beyond stereotypes into the deeply idiosyncratic strange of individual minds. But however you choose to make your clown, remember the golden rule of being funny and make your clowns harmlessly eccentric, their oddness a danger only to themselves. Because this is where the funny comes from in a sitcom. It comes from harmlessly eccentric clown characters. It doesn't come from writing jokes. I can't stress this point enough. Sitcoms are not about jokes. They're about characters. Characters called clowns who act in deeply funny ways. So instead of writing jokes, create a character with a slightly offbeat mind. Then imagine what that atypical character would typically do. Whatever it is will automatically be funny, unless it mortally threatens your audience, in which case, just dial it back a hair. To create your first clown character, it can help to start with some of your own peculiarities. If no one was watching, what would you do? What's the inner freak inside your mind? What's the deep peculiarity that lies at the root of all your rogue dreams and desires? Or study the people around you for their deep eccentricities. Your family, your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors. They may pretend to be normal, but inside, they're all bananas. As much as you can, try to keep the weirdness of your clowns simple, because all of the zany behavior of each sitcom character can always be traced back to its own single psychological root. Homer is a glutton. Lisa is superior. Bart is attention-seeking. Marge is anxious. To keep audiences invested in your clowns, you want to maintain this psychological consistency, so don't ever change your clown's fundamental weirdness. Instead, to keep things fresh, show your clown's simple weirdness playing out in more and more elaborate ways. The simplest way to do this is to transport your clowns into a variety of different situations. How would your inner freak act at a wedding, on vacation, at a children's party at the zoo? This method of generating humor is where sitcoms get their name. They're situation comedies because the characters are always the same, but the situations are changing. After all, when you're weird, every new situation is a chance to do something no one's seen before. So when Homer visits a Krusty Burger in Amsterdam, his dreams of gluttony become about fries with mayo and sweet, sweet golden Krusty Burger beer. While Lisa's dreams of moral superiority become about destroying the Krusties so the Amsterdammers can recover their original national cuisine, raw herring with onion and gherkins. Delicious. Once you've created one clown, make more. The absolute minimum for a sitcom is 2 main clowns, and most sitcoms have 3 or 4. Often, they can have 5 or 6, because sitcoms are like clown cars. There's always room for one more. Okay, let's move on now from characters to plot. Since the characters of sitcoms are all clowns, they're a natural source of sitcom plots. And sitcom plots, as we've seen, are set in motion by a problem that characters create for themselves. And clowns are always creating problems for themselves. No sooner are they seized by one of their idiosyncratic desires or schemes or obsessions than they're crashing ahead, trying to make it a reality and colliding with all the other clowns around. In the case of this episode of The Simpsons, 2 of the characters create problems for themselves, resulting in an A plot and a B plot. In the A plot, Homer's lust for alcohol gets him locked up for drunk driving, bringing him in conflict with Marge. In the B plot, Lisa's desire to be praised for her intelligence leads her on a quest to win the school science fair, bringing her into conflict with Bart. The key here is that in both plots, the clown's normal psychological drives lead them to create a problem that then puts them in conflict with another character. That conflict with another character then leads to an escalation. In the case of Homer, the escalation is his increasingly desperate attempts to avoid alcohol. He tries to distract himself at the science fair. He tries to distract himself with TV. He tries to distract himself at a Tupperware party. And on each of these occasions, his inner struggle becomes more and more absurdly heightened until he's fantasizing about murdering everyone at the Tupperware party for 1 drop of sweet, sweet golden beer. In the case of Lisa, she comes up with increasingly sophisticated ways to manipulate Bart, placing treats just out of his reach, electrocuting cupcakes, and finally outsmarting Bart and his Bond villain act. So these escalations are simply a chain of increasing absurdities that are driven by the character's conflict. Once the original dream is set in motion, they follow organically from it. Toward the end of the episode, the A and B plots intersect when Homer goes to the science fair, and then in the episode's final beats, each of the plots resolves itself. Lisa loses the science fair, crushing her dreams of glory. And Homer realizes that he actually likes spending time with Marge, so he finds a painless way to be sober. You'll notice that one of these endings is almost tragic, while the other is cheerfully romantic. In comedies that are a little darker, the tragic crushing of a dream is more common. In comedies that are a little more sentimental, comic togetherness is the more usual way to wrap things up. Like Homer, the rogue character learns a lesson, inspiring us to learn it too. But either kind of ending works. The important thing is that at the end, the characters finally stop making their self-inflicted problem worse. Maybe they give up. Maybe the world crushes them. Maybe the other characters rescue them. It's up to you and what you want your audience to feel. You might be asking yourself, why does this episode of The Simpsons have 2 plots, an A plot and a B plot? Do all sitcoms have 2 plots? They don't, but most tend to. Partly that's because it's hard to stretch a single plot line out for an entire episode. And having 2 plots also adds to the comic richness of the world by involving more characters and more weird problems. If you feel like it, you can even toss in a C plot. But since all of these plots work the same way, starting with a nothing problem and then escalating, Don't worry too much about the number of plots when you first sit down to write. Just create your A plot, and if it's too thin, then fill in the gaps with a B plot or a C. Let's talk now about the sitcom's comic tone. As we saw back in our introductory lecture on tone, there are a couple of simple ways to generate a comic tone. First, focus on everyday people and objects. Second, describe the world in multiple voices. The Simpsons shows how both of these are done. First, everything in the episode is drawn from daily life. We see the insides of workplaces, of schools, of bars, of churches, of living rooms. Almost all sitcoms stick to these everyday places, and even sitcoms that go a little further afield create their own sense of regular life by returning to the same communal locations again and again. Second, each character in the episode has his or her own voice. This isn't Game of Thrones, where the characters all mostly use the same syntax and vocabulary. Instead, The Simpsons is a smorgasbord of different dialects. Bart says things like, "I caramba," and "eat my shorts," while Lisa says things like, "The hamster has learned a valuable lesson. Beware the hand of man." So when you're writing your first sitcom, set it somewhere ordinary, and give each of your clowns a little of their own extraordinary dialect. Now let's sum up our blueprint for sitcom writing by looking at a couple scenes that perfectly embody the Simpsons engine. The first scene is a one-man comic routine, courtesy of Homer, when he gets his inner voice and his outer voice confused at breakfast.
Bart, don't give the dog cigarettes.
Well, time to go to work. Little do they know I'm ducking out early to take the Duff Brewery tour. Roll in at 9, punch out at 5. That's the plan. They don't suspect a thing. Well, off to the plant. Then to the Duff Brewery. Uh-oh, did I say that or just think it? I gotta think of a line fast.
Homer, are you going to the Duff Brewery?
Here, Homer is so lost in his own thoughts that he doesn't realize that there's no need for him to explain his plans for the day. Marge already has her hands full with Bart and his cigarette antics. But because Homer is oblivious, his gluttonous nature gets him into an unnecessary clash with his wife. So there, in its most elemental form, is a nothing problem. First, a character creates a crisis for himself where it doesn't need to exist. And second, that crisis brings him into conflict with the society around. We get another crisp example of the Simpsons sitcom blueprint in the scene where Homer attends an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. The meeting begins with Ned Flanders shuddering in horror at the time he had a blackberry schnapps. Then the world's oldest looking man confesses that drinking has ruined his life, because he is in fact only 31. Then Homer grouchily informs everyone that he's there because a judge made him come, which leads the Reverend to reach out sympathetically. "Homer, with our help, you'll never touch a beer again," prompting Homer to shriek and jump out the window. So this scene offers an elegant mini blueprint of the endless conflict between the individual and the social that drives every beat of every sitcom. First, we have a sequence of totally eccentric characters, each driven by his own weird and distinct psychology to make a problem for themselves. But then, they all come together in the shared moment of the AA confession, so that for an instant, the individual and the social merge. Until, in the final beat, Homer's rogue psychology bursts it all apart. So that's the basic blueprint for writing a sitcom. First, start with the engine, a conflict between the individual and the social. Then add your tweak to the engine to make it unique. Make the individuals from some hidden subgenre of human life, or make the social bond one that we haven't seen in a sitcom before. Then create 3 or 4 clown characters, giving each of them their own psychological quirk. Pick one of these clowns and imagine the sort of unnecessary problem he would create for himself. Then imagine what other clown that problem would bring him in conflict with, and how the problem would compound itself, escalating the clown's absurdly self-destructive schemes and actions. That's your A-plot, and if it seems a little thin, now pick a second clown and repeat. And then, at the end of your episode, have all the clown's self-inflicted problems evaporate, as they're humbled to abandon their mayhem-creating plots and obsessions and schemes, or as their community joins in to help a little part of their kooky dreams come true. If you want to get started on a sitcom, here's a couple exercises you can try. First, watch an episode of your favorite sitcom, identify its engine, and then add one tweak of your own, modifying either the individual clowns or their greater social bond. Second, take one of your new clowns and imagine the kind of problem they'd create for themselves. Then imagine how the problem escalates. And finally, how it goes away. In 1887, a retired army surgeon by the name of Dr. Watson related a story about a curious crime. The police couldn't solve it, so they enlisted the aid of an even more curious fellow named Sherlock Holmes. Holmes arrived at the crime scene with a magnifying glass and measuring tape, and he promptly got to the bottom of things. The murderer was 6 feet tall. He had small feet and a red face. He liked cheap Indian cigars. And he hadn't trimmed the fingernails on his right hand for several days. The readers of Dr. Watson's story loved it. They couldn't get enough of Sherlock Holmes. They wanted more curious crimes and more astonishing solutions. So Arthur Conan Doyle, the real author of Dr. Watson's Little Tale, cranked out story after story, 60 in all. And when he finally threw up his hands in exhaustion, other authors stepped in, creating their own curious crimes and their own astonishing crime solvers. And so the crime procedural was born. Strictly speaking, Sherlock Holmes wasn't the first astonishing crime solver in literature. If you'd like to go all the way back to the beginning, you can read Edgar Allan Poe's brilliant little story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which hails from 1841. But the 60 cases of Sherlock Holmes demonstrated that audiences would happily watch the same crime solver solve crime after crime after crime. So Conan Doyle is the true founding father of the procedural, the genre of TV writing we'll be exploring today. Like the sitcom, the procedural migrated from the page and the stage to the radio in the early 20th century, and by the 1950s it had followed I Love Lucy in making the jump to TV. The most famous of these early procedurals was Dragnet, which began in 1949 as a radio show. Dragnet's main characters were Sergeant Joe Friday and his colleagues in the LAPD. But the real hero of the show was police procedure. Every crime was solved by the book. Witnesses were questioned. Suspects were interviewed. Crime scenes were cased for clues, which were handed over to the lab for careful forensic analysis. The show even chronicled the detectives' paperwork, because the same police department procedure that was used to fill out forms was what tracked down every criminal. Dragnet was a huge hit. It ran for over 300 episodes on radio and made the jump to TV in 1951, where it ran for almost 300 episodes more. At the peak of Dragnet's popularity, from 1953 to 1954, it was the second highest rated show on TV, behind only I Love Lucy. And Dragnet established what would become the basic blueprint for later procedurals. Every episode began with a robbery, a murder, a human bomb, or some other problem. And every time, that problem was solved by the same basic standard operating procedure. This emphasis on consistent problem solving made Dragnet a kind of mirror image to I Love Lucy's consistent problem making. As we saw in our lecture on sitcoms, every sitcom begins with the problem that the main character creates. That problem gets worse and worse, leading to more disasters and complications, until at the end, the character capitulates and things go back to normal. In procedurals, it's the inverse. Every episode begins with the problem that the main character sets out to solve. That problem is unraveled piece by piece through a series of breakthroughs and discoveries until at the end the character triumphs and things go back to normal. So like sitcoms, procedurals are driven by an opening problem. The difference is that the characters don't make the problem. They make the solution through a consistent problem-solving procedure. Dragnet was so popular that, like I Love Lucy, it was rebooted in the 1960s, and it quickly went on to inspire a host of imitators, from Police Story and Kojak in the 1970s to Hill Street Blues and Miami Vice in the 1980s, to later shows like NYPD Blue, NCIS, Law & Order, Criminal Minds, Psych, Monk, The Mentalist. The list goes on. Each new show had its own innovation. Some focused on newfangled kinds of standard operating procedures, like those of FBI profilers. Others focused on more idiosyncratic crime-solving procedures, like the quirky intuitions of a germophobic private eye. Some drew back the curtain to reveal more about the characters who solved the crimes. Others explored different kinds of crimes, like ones with special victims, or those involving military personnel. And as procedurals innovated and diversified, they began to reach beyond crime solving into other kinds of problem solving. For example, there's the TV procedural House, which gets its name from a play on Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, House, Holmes, House. Just like Holmes, House is a man of science. But unlike Holmes, House is a doctor, so he applies the methods of forensic science to solving medical mysteries. Like House, modern TV procedurals can take place anywhere, in crime labs or Oval Offices, superhero lairs or PR firms. All that matters is that there's a consistent stream of problems to be solved, and a single, unchanging procedure for solving all of them. So that's the core engine of all procedurals, a collision between a serial set of problems and a serial problem solver. To expand that basic engine into a more detailed blueprint for launching your own procedural, we'll use this lecture to reverse engineer the pilot episode of the most successful and influential procedural of the early 21st century, CSI. CSI premiered on CBS in 2000, and it ran for 15 seasons, during which it spun off 3 other shows. It was the #1 ranked show in 2002, and it was ranked in the top 5 for 6 other seasons. It picked up a half-dozen Emmys, and it became a cultural phenomenon, transforming the way that Americans saw crime solving and forensics. And it was also created by a first-time TV writer, an unknown who broke through without any industry contacts or experience. So even if you're living off Hollywood's beaten track, it shows you what you can do. We'll be discussing the 2-part pilot episode, which was split into the first 2 episodes of Season 1, titled Pilot and Cool Change. So for the purposes of this lecture, both Pilot and Cool Change will be referred to together as the pilot. When I say the end of the pilot, I mean the end of Cool Change. Let's start, as always, by identifying the cognitive effect of the pilot's script's ending, using it to reverse engineer the main engine, or world conflict, that drives the whole series. So if you haven't seen the 2-part pilot for CSI or read the scripts, now's the time to hit pause so you can enjoy it. The pilot to CSI has a 2-part ending. In the first part of the ending, Gil Grissom, the lead crime scene investigator, solves a casino crime. In the second part, the CSI team forgives a member of their unit for making a human mistake. Each part of the ending has its own cognitive effect, which together make up the total experience of CSI. So let's break them down one at a time, starting with when Grissom solves the casino crime. Grissom wraps this case in spectacular fashion. Turning back time to witness a murder as it actually happened, Grissom sees something that he wasn't there to see. This is a leap beyond even Sherlock Holmes. Where Holmes could tell us what the murderer was wearing, Grissom can show us what the murderer was literally seeing, watching the crime as the killer saw it happen, experiencing a flashback from the killer's own memory. Who can do that? Who can see into other people's minds, grasping their hidden crimes, reliving their secret memories, exactly as they happened? Only God, right? Only God can see like that. So by having Grissom flash back into someone else's memories, the script establishes that Grissom has a God's eye. Now, of course, Grissom is not actually God, but the point is that Grissom seems like a god. His forensic procedures give him the power of omniscience, making him appear divine. Which is why Grissom lightly taunts the murderer by telling her that her deceased boyfriend told him all about the crime. Because Grissom's forensics have allowed him to do what God does, and talk to the dead. And it's not just Grissom who feels divine in this moment. By including us, the audience, in Grissom's flashback, the script gives us the same experience. For a moment, we feel like we have the power to resurrect the past and see into people's secret hearts. And this feeling is exhilarating. As one of the characters sums it up, it's like being King Kong on cocaine. Because although cocaine doesn't actually make you superhuman, it makes you feel like you can do anything. Just to be clear, that's a metaphor. Please don't try cocaine at home. Watch CSI instead. So that's the first half of CSI's cognitive effect, a feeling of euphoric omniscience when we see the solution to the crime. And like any stimulant, it can be addictive. The second half of the pilot's cognitive effect is less intoxicating. In the final beats of the pilot, CSI member Warwick Brown tries to resign, confessing to Grissom that he's got a gambling addiction that inadvertently led to a trainee agent's death. But Grissom refuses to accept Brown's resignation, insisting that if Brown messed up, so did every member of his unit. We're all culpable in this, Grissom says, and handing Brown back his badge, Grissom welcomes him back onto the team. So for a moment, this seems like the ending of a sitcom. A character has created a self-inflicted problem driven by his own rogue psychology, in this case, a gambling problem. But in the end, the problem is forgotten and the group takes him back. Except that the problem can't be forgotten, because the trainee agent is dead for good. And so instead of ending with a tidy sitcom reconciliation, the pilot for CSI carries on for one more beat. And in that beat, unlike at the end of The Simpsons or Friends, the characters don't go home together. Instead, each of them goes home on their own, leaving Brown in the parking lot alone. So the result is the feeling of a sitcom that fails. This is a story world where people try to reform and try to forgive and forget. But as much as the characters of CSI all do their best, at the end of the day, people still end up alone. So the self-inflicted mistakes don't stop. They keep piling up as people's rogue psychologies get them into more trouble and more. This is the other face of CSI. Not the solving of problems, but the making of problems. That's why the pilot is set in the underbelly of Las Vegas, a lonely place where people never manage to form real relationships. A fallen city where people are endlessly dragged down by the mistakes that they make for themselves. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and so the city has become the place where people go to wallow in the vices that they're too ashamed to acknowledge elsewhere. It's a repository of all our dark and shameful impulses, a giant grease trap for the American soul. When we see this ongoing state of fallenness in the last beats of the pilot episode, we feel our God euphoria fading. We come down from our King Kong high and realize that we haven't fixed the world and recreated paradise. Vegas is still seething with weird desires and egomaniacal dreams. It's still a sitcom gone wrong, where our individual differences lead not to a renewed togetherness, but to selfishness, mayhem, and violence. So with this second part of the ending, the pilot for CSI leaves us feeling unfulfilled. We've solved one superficial problem, but the deep source of all the problems is still inside us, dooming more crimes to occur. This dual cognitive effect of euphoria and emptiness is what keeps audiences coming back for more episodes of CSI. Each time a case is solved, you feel a King Kong kick of victory. And then the triumph fades, and you see the deeper problems that remain, leading you to want to queue up another episode and get that kick of victory again. This dual cognitive effect points us to the special engine of CSI. As we've seen, the engine of every procedural is broadly the same. The conflict is between the forces that generate the problem and the procedures that solve it. But a vast number of different procedural shows have been built out of this basic engine by modifying one side of the conflict or the other. By modifying, that is, either the problems or the procedures. Sometimes the problems in a TV procedural come from our petty impulses. Sometimes they come from our buried subterranean desires. Sometimes they come from social or cultural forces. And sometimes their origins are entirely non-human, like diseases or natural disasters or the otherworldly phenomena in the X-Files. Sometimes the problems manifest themselves as heists, sometimes as murders, sometimes as terrorist acts, sometimes as cyber hacks. There are endless tweaks you can make to this side of the engine. On the other side of the conflict, the procedures can be organizational and by the book, or they can be specific to a particular subfield of science, or they can reflect one individual's specific habits of mind. They can even be informed by science fiction or the paranormal or magic. So there's a huge range of innovation on this side of the engine as well. In the case of CSI, the innovation is to make the problem the fallenness of human nature, and to make the procedure the God's eye of science. So you can think of it as a kind of modern procedural twist on biblical justice. The problem is Sin City, and the solution is forensic omniscience. Here's how the pilot establishes those two conflicting forces, starting with the dark force of human nature. The pilot's first full-length crime is introduced at the beginning of its second half. Things begin when a lucky casino goer wins $40 million and is led to the presidential suite with his girlfriend. Thrilled to be rich, his girlfriend steps out onto the balcony, at which point the big winner tells her to take a hike. Come on, I'm a millionaire now. Why would I want to waste any more time with you? Here's the ugly side of Las Vegas. Money changes everything. And then the ugliness gets uglier, because the man's girlfriend promptly murders him in revenge. And when she's asked later whether she feels any remorse or even anything at all, she simply answers no. So that's how you set up one side of your conflict. You depict a problem that encapsulates the root cause of all the problems in your story world. In this case, a crime that sums up all the dark human lusts and desires that come out at night in Vegas. And all the crimes in the CSI pilot are carefully constructed to reveal this grim underbelly of our common human nature. For example, there's the happily married man we meet in the pilot's opening beats. As he tells the detectives, he loves his wife. They've been married for 31 years now. He's never cheated on her, ever. But then, this happily married man comes into town for a convention, and he's sitting in the lounge, minding his own business, when a sweet-smelling brunette comes up, and the next thing he knows, she's nibbling on his earlobe, and he finds himself in a hotel room with his face mashed up into her chest. This is the deep problem that Las Vegas exposes. All of us, no matter how happy we might be, have animal desires lurking within. And in Vegas, those animal desires in all of our hearts are unleashed. So that's how the pilot establishes the core problem of its story world. It doesn't show us hardened criminals. It shows us ordinary people who come to Vegas and have their subterranean desires exposed by a $40 million payout or a sweet-smelling brunette or some other temptation that all of us feel. Because by showing how ordinary people are led by extraordinary temptation into sin, the pilot reveals that the problem of the world runs deeper than a few bad apples. We're all potential criminals in Vegas because what's rotten is human nature itself. Against the problem of human nature, the pilot then pits the other half of its engine, the problem-solving procedure of the scientific method. Here's how Grissom introduces this scientific procedure. We scrutinize the crime scene, collect the evidence, recreate what happened without ever having been there. Grissom's forensic method, in other words, is to reverse engineer history through an analysis of the physical data that remains. So Grissom doesn't just speculate about the past, he knows. He can see it exactly. This is Grissom's God's eye, and it's explained further in a conversation he has with Brown. Forget about the husband. Forget about the assumptions. Forget about your promotion. These things will only confuse you. Concentrate on what cannot lie, the evidence. To which Brown replies with a nod, follow the shoe. So the forensic procedure of CSI ignores our career dreams and our assumptions, and it even ignores the witnesses and the suspects, because all of these things are human, and humans are tainted. Humans lie and forget and make mistakes. because in the story world of CSI, human nature is intrinsically corrupt. Every witness is touched by original sin. So the true scientist turns his eyes away from humans to focus entirely on the physical evidence. Fingerprints and shoes and blood splatter cannot lie. These are the honest truth. This CSI method takes forensic science to a level far beyond Dragnet or Sherlock Holmes. In those earlier procedurals, the detectives always took the time to interview witnesses and people of interest. But according to Grissom, that was a mistake, because it introduced a human fallibility into science. And so the procedures of the CSI unit leave the imperfect memories and self-interested distortions of witnesses behind. They achieve Grissom's God's eye by freeing themselves entirely from human nature. With this innovation in crime solving, CSI cleanly establishes its core conflict. On one side is human nature and the errors that it breeds. On the other is science and the divine omniscience it permits. Human versus God. That's the engine of the show. And that's why the experience of watching is a mix of human emptiness and heavenly euphoria. Every crime reflects the ugly realities of human nature, while the crime-solving procedure is divinely human-free. Now that we've seen how CSI establishes its engine, let's look at how it introduces its characters. We first meet Grissom when he's deducing a victim's time of death by examining the size of a maggot, after which Grissom goes back to his office to break in a new recruit. The recruit confesses to feeling lightheaded, so Grissom reaches into his refrigerator, and in between a bottle of yellow liquid and a container with something green, Grissom grabs a jar of bugs. He then hands a bug to the recruit, promising that it'll boost her blood sugar and take away her lightheadedness. And to prove his point, Grissom pops a bug in his own mouth and chews. With this clever little scene, Grissom establishes that his only God is science. Sure, your stomach might turn at the thought of eating a bug, but that's the problem with human nature. It's irrational. It doesn't know that bugs are good for its blood sugar, and so human nature has to be overruled. Grissom is, in short, firmly on one side of the show's central conflict. He's on the side of science. The next main character introduced by the CSI pilot is Brown. And following the usual method of pilot writing that we discussed in our lecture on Game of Thrones, the CSI pilot introduces Brown as being on the opposite side of the show's central conflict from Grissom, creating a clash between the two characters. While Grissom is cool and scientifically calculating, Brown is so hot for his promotion that he gets entangled with a corrupt judge. So in Brown, we see the opposite of science. We see human nature with all its faults and follies. And the other CSI personnel all fall somewhere in between. Take, for example, Brass. Brass is inhuman enough to work up an appetite for donuts while looking at maggots, but he's also fallibly human, like when he casually remarks to a new recruit that her mother made a good cop, prompting the recruit to snap back, "Sir, with all due respect, I thought the key to being a lucid crime scene investigator was to reserve judgment until the evidence vindicates or eliminates assumption." So Brass is on the spectrum between Brown and Grissom, half man, half microscope. Catherine Willows also falls in the middle of this spectrum. While investigating a disturbing case in which a child is sexually assaulted, Willows focuses clinically on the evidence. But then she races home to see her daughter, confessing, "I couldn't drive here fast enough to tell you how much I love you." That, in brief, is how a procedural pilot establishes character. Like the serial drama or the sitcom or any other kind of TV show, it has a range of characters who span from one side of its central conflict to the other. And the procedural pilot introduces these characters sequentially, beginning first with Grissom, who is on one extreme of the conflict, and Brown, who is on the other extreme, before fleshing out Willows and the other characters who fit somewhere in the middle of the conflict. Because as always in TV, characters are our window into that deeper conflict of the story world. So the external conflict between Brown and Grissom and the internal conflicts felt by Brass and Willows work to introduce the audience to CSI's eternal struggle between the animals we are and the gods we can become. Now that we've talked character, let's talk a little about plot. The way to plot a procedural is to reverse engineer it, starting with the answer to a problem and then building back the steps you need to get there. So in the case of a typical episode of CSI, the writers imagine an ingenious crime and then build back all the evidence needed to solve it, planting that evidence in earlier scenes. To take an example from the pilot, let's imagine an ingenious crime where female prostitutes put a knockout drug on their nipples, allowing them to incapacitate and rob their unsuspecting male clients. How do we reverse engineer this into an actual beat-by-beat plot? Well, first, we'd have a scene where the cops examine a male victim, noticing a discoloration on the victim's mouth. Then we'd have a scene where a second unconscious victim is found, this time a female victim. But in a puzzling twist, there's no discoloration around the female victim's mouth. So what's going on? Why is the female victim different from the male victim? Then we'd insert one more clue. When the doctors examine the female victim, she's got the discoloration on her nipples, and suddenly all the pieces fit together. The knockout drug on the male victim's mouth was also on the female victim's nipples. So the female victim is not, in fact, a victim. She's a perp, and she accidentally knocked herself out. And that's how you do it every time. Invent a clever crime and then reverse engineer the clues needed to solve it, releasing a new clue in each scene, like a jigsaw puzzle you hand out one piece at a time. But this isn't the only kind of reverse engineering that CSI employs. If it was all just clues and fitting them together, the show would get predictable. So the writers also reverse engineer red herrings and misdirections and other story delays. One kind of delay is to plant inconclusive evidence, like the ineffective mouth swab that doesn't yield the data that the investigators need. Another kind of delay is to have hidden pieces of evidence that can only be discovered through a special scientific process, like the toenail clipping found in the bathroom with special light. Another way to reverse engineer delays is to have investigators like Brown who are slowed in their investigations by their human bias. And another way is to borrow a trick from sitcoms and have multiple plot lines. By weaving these plot lines together, each serves to slow down the other, drawing out the suspense and flooding viewers with clues that keep them busy. The big point here is that there isn't an absolute plot structure that you need to follow from episode to episode of your procedural. The process of creating the plot for each episode is simply to imagine an ingenious crime or medical mystery or some other problem. Then reverse engineer the evidence, dispensing it drip by drip, and then reverse engineer delays and complications as needed. If one problem isn't enough to keep the plot interesting, imagine one or two more so that you've got multiple plot lines, all going at once. And if you're having a hard time coming up with an ingenious enough crime, here are a few tried and true tricks to get you started. 1. Do what the script for Chinatown does and combine two standard crimes into a single one, like a murder that's staged to cover up something worse. 2. Do what Poe does in The Murders of the Rue Morgue, when he makes the murderer an orangutan. And think about how a non-standard criminal, like an agoraphobic nursing student, or a dirty FBI agent, or even something non-human, would go about a standard crime, so that the methods of operation and the clues left behind are all unusual and idiosyncratic. 3. Do some research. Talk to some cops, like the creator of CSI did. Case a few joints, study some failed heists, and figure out how you troubleshoot them. That way, if this whole screenwriting thing doesn't work out, you'll have a backup plan to get rich. Now, let's reverse engineer the final story element of the CSI pilot, its tone. Like the tone of all TV scripts, the tone of procedurals is reverse engineered to connect audiences to the show's core conflict. So in the case of CSI, the tone is reverse engineered to heighten the show's cognitive mix of divine euphoria and human emptiness. The tone heightens the first half of this cognitive effect, the divine euphoria, by playing up the extraordinary nature of its crime-solving procedures. These procedures are portrayed as colorful, dazzling, gorgeous. Like stained glass windows, they offer a holy glimpse into the hidden mystery of things, and CSI has won multiple Emmys for its beautiful special effects. The tone of CSI then heightens the second half of the show's cognitive effect, human emptiness, through its dark and grimy crime scenes. The show is set at night, allowing shadows to permeate everything, making the world feel lonely and grim, like the underground lusts that bubble up from the caverns of our heart. So to sum up this two-part tone, we can say that like the eye of God, the narrator of CSI establishes a clear dividing line between right and wrong by boosting both the lightness and the dark, giving us both the brightest truths that shine above and the foulest things that crawl beneath. Now let's sum up our blueprint for writing a procedural by examining a scene that captures the whole engine of CSI in miniature. In this scene, Grissom is brooding over the physical evidence retrieved from the casino, because that evidence doesn't add up. The casino security has no record of the electronic lock of the victim's room being triggered, so that evidence suggests that the victim left his room and died elsewhere. But Grissom has found carpet fibers from the room in the victim's watch band, so that evidence suggests that the victim was in fact killed in the room and was dragged across the floor. So the evidence seems to point in two different directions at once. Apparently, evidence can be as conflicted and fallible as human nature. But then Grissom has a realization that resolves the apparent conflict in the evidence. And that realization is that there must be a tiny bug in the casino's security system. Specifically, if a key is inserted in a door lock when the door is open, then left in the lock while the door is closed, and then later removed after the door is reopened, the security system must fail to record the door opening the second time. This is an incredibly complicated sequence of events to intuit, and Grissom has no special knowledge of casino doors. But the evidence tells him it must be true, and when he conducts a little experiment with the casino staff, they confirm it. He's found a bug in their system. The brilliance of this moment is that the crime scene investigator uses existing evidence to predict where other evidence will be, because this is the true modern scientific method. The old medieval version of science was simply about interpreting data. The new modern version is to use this data to make predictions about what will happen in later experiments. Because when you make an accurate prediction about the future, you prove that you've glimpsed into the deep nature of things. So with this scene, the pilot illustrates both the method and the miracle of the CSI procedure. By following science exactly, it does what no mortal eye can do and sees into tomorrow. So that's the blueprint for launching a procedural. Build the engine by devising either a unique kind of problem or a special procedure for addressing it. Write an ending for your pilot episode that captures the cognitive experience of both the problem and the problem solving. Create one main character who offers a window into the psychology of the problem solving. Introduce him first. Create another character who offers a window into the psychology of the problem making. Introduce him second, establishing the conflict. And then reinforce the conflict by introducing 2 or 3 more characters who struggle internally with it in their hearts. Then lay in the plot of your pilot by reverse engineering back from the problem's final solution. And finally, build in a tone that reinforces the core cognitive experience of both the problem and the problem solving in the audience's mind, creating an addictive mix of aha moments and intriguing problems waiting to be solved. If you'd like to get started on your own procedural pilot, here are a couple of exercises to get you going. First, watch an episode of your favorite procedural. Identify its engine, and then add one tweak of your own, modifying either the problem or the problem solving. Second, create 2 characters to act as windows into your new engine. One who's more a problem solver, the other who's more a problem. There are 2 types of people in the world. People who think soap operas are a guilty pleasure, and people who think that soaps are a sign of cultural Armageddon. Whichever group you're in, you're wrong, because soaps are a brilliant and enduring form of story. True, they get their name from 20th century dish detergent ads, but they've been around in different forms for millennia, all the way back at least as far as Homer's Odyssey. The Odyssey is the story of a man with a powerful longing. He wants to get back home, to see his wife, to see his child. Along the way, he encounters a cyclops and sirens and a witch who turns men into pigs. And as Odysseus struggles with these strange and terrible monsters, he wrestles with his own wayward fears and desires until he finds himself marooned in the arms of a shapely nymph who happens not to be his wife. Until finally, Odysseus pulls himself free, battles his way back to his home, and liberates it from a horde of greedy, devouring men. Now you might say, all of this is ludicrous. There are no monsters or beautiful nymphs in the world. And why should we admire a guy who sleeps around and then comes back home to murder all the men his wife is entertaining? Isn't he at best a hypocrite and at worst a psychopath? Well, yes, logically speaking, you might be right about all that. But the Odyssey is interested in a different kind of reality than literal common sense. The Odyssey is interested in an emotional reality. It's an attempt to communicate how we feel and to explore the diversity of our feelings and give them weight. It projects our feelings out onto the world. It transforms our desires and anxieties into nymphs and monsters. And it shows its characters acting out all the deep emotions in our hearts, from the heroic to the carnal, from the murderous to the romantic. This style of storytelling has long had its detractors. It's often been called hysterical and feminine. There's a bizarre conspiracy theory that the Odyssey must have been written by an unhinged woman, perhaps one of Homer's less rational daughters. And this style of writing has also led generations of balding philosophers to warn against the evils of a writing technique known as the pathetic fallacy. What's the pathetic fallacy? Well, it's a term coined by the 19th century Victorian art critic John Ruskin that's now frequently used to denigrate artworks that ascribe human feelings to inhuman things. For example, when a poem suggests that trees are weeping or the sun is smiling down. In a superficial way, this is, of course, a fallacy. Trees and suns don't have tear ducts and mouths, QED, case closed. But in a less pedantic sense, the term pathetic fallacy is misleading, because one of the true powers of art is to remake our perception of the world, recreating reality as we see it. Which is to say that art can in fact make us feel the forests weep or the heavens rejoice. And that's what the Odyssey does. It communicates what it feels like to be separated from the ones you love, to have to fight demons and nightmares and the temptations in your heart, and to finally come home and overcome the feeling that you've been displaced, so you can make your heart whole once again. This outward expression of human feelings is what all good soap operas do. They capture the deep fears and desires of our hearts and project them out onto a story world, crafting a narrative that's true not in an objective, but in a subjective sense. True in that it holds up a mirror to our psyches, showing us what we really are inside. After the Odyssey, the basic script form of the soap was popularized in 17th and 18th century romances and sentimental comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Conscious Lovers, and it became a mainstay of American daytime TV in the 1950s. Like the Odyssey, these more recent soaps construct their story worlds as windows into human sentiment, so their laws of physics are replaced by the laws of the human heart. What are these laws of the human heart? Well, all our hearts are different, of course, or to be more technically correct for you skeptics out there, all the emotional parts of our brains that poets have historically mislabeled as our hearts are different. But even so, there are some broad trends about our emotions that modern psychologists have identified. These aren't absolute laws, but they work for enough of the people, enough of the time, to touch a large audience. One such law is that our hearts generally feel that bad deeds should be punished and good deeds rewarded. Like many of our strong emotions, this desire for justice is so evolutionarily ancient that it's shared by other primates. And so to mirror back our heart's primeval desire for just desserts, soaps are often rich in a plot technique known as poetic justice, which rewards the good characters with happy endings and gives bad characters an unpleasant comeuppance. Another general law of human hearts is our superstitious desire to believe that everything happens for a reason. Maybe it was those special socks we wore. Maybe someone in the sky was looking out for us. And so it is that soaps are often filled with providential twists, gratifying our emotional desire to believe that there's a guiding light that steers us through the midnight of our life. Or as one more example of these general laws of the heart, we have a deep need to believe that our dreams can be achieved. And so soap operas are thick with wish fulfillment, as the world itself works to make human desires come true. In a soap, if you want it, you usually get it, because that's how your heart believes life should be. Now, all this discussion of the emotional logic of soaps might just be feeding your naysaying concern that there's something wrong with them. After all, science may have revealed that we instinctively believe in poetic justice and special socks and the power of human wishes, but science has also shown that all of these things are delusions. Reason and facts and data reveal that the world doesn't in fact work the way that our emotions want. So soaps are at odds with the real way of things, which seems to suggest that there must be only two types of people who tune in: people who are indulging themselves and people who've been bamboozled. But in fact, this isn't the case, because although it's true that our emotions aren't always right about the laws of physics, they remain an inescapable part of our own human reality. Even the most logical scientists fall in love. Even the most rational philosophers miss their families. So we can't just dismiss our feelings, even if we wanted to. They're true facts of our human world, inescapable data of our subjective experience, which means that we need to study and understand them. And there's no better way of coming to know our emotions than through soaps. Soaps can help us work through emotions that we don't want to feel as much, or they can help us intensify feelings we see as important, or they can just help us feel more comfortable and happy in ourselves, offering respite from a modern world that's often too busy to acknowledge how we feel. So like a diet rich in salads and grains, soap watching is good for your heart. And despite their reputation for being foolish and irrational, soaps can also be fiercely smart. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is legendary for its ironic self-awareness. Downton Abbey has received an Emmy, a Golden Globe, and a special BAFTA for its witty banter. Mad Men has been celebrated as one of the most intelligent TV shows of the 21st century, earning multiple Emmys for its writing. All of these are primetime soaps, and many other celebrated TV shows, from MASH to The Wire to Game of Thrones, have a little bit of soap in them. In this lecture, we'll learn how to launch our own soap opera by studying the most popular primetime soap of the past decade, ABC's Grey's Anatomy. Grey's has lasted an astonishing 13 seasons and counting. It's been nominated for over 36 Emmys and earned a top 10 rating for the prime 18 to 49 demographic for all but one of its seasons. So let's turn to its pilot and see how it made all these dreams come true. To reverse engineer the story engine that makes Grey's Anatomy go, we'll use our regular method and begin by identifying the cognitive effect of the pilot's ending as precisely as we can. So if you haven't had a chance to watch or read the pilot for Grey's Anatomy, hit pause so you can enjoy it now. In the final scene of Grey's Anatomy's pilot, Meredith visits her mom in a nursing home to tell her that she's decided not to sell the house. "It's home, you know," to which her mom blankly responds, "Are you the doctor?" With this sharp twist, the scene reveals Meredith's mother has Alzheimer's. She doesn't know her own child. So Meredith tries to remind her, "Mom, it's me, your daughter." But Meredith's mother just fidgets blankly. All she can remember is that maybe she was a doctor once herself. And with that, the pilot fades out. So this ending is a heartbreaker, and it breaks your heart in a very specific way. It makes you feel what it is to have a mother and not have a mother all at the same time, to feel so close to someone who doesn't feel close to you, to share something precious that then isn't reciprocated. In other words, the scene makes us feel like we belong and don't belong at the same time. This is our family, but it isn't. This is our home, but it isn't. This is our life, but we're a stranger in it. Alzheimer's will give you that feeling, and it's the experience of the end of the pilot of Grey's Anatomy. To be home and to be a stranger, an Odysseus who returns to find a family who doesn't remember. As always with TV pilots, the cognitive experience of the last beats of the pilot point us to the engine that drives the whole show. In the case of Grey's Anatomy, that engine is the conflict between our desire to belong and our anxiety that we don't. We want to be accepted, to be part of the group, but we always feel outside. This is a conflict that most of us have felt at some time or other. We even feel it sometimes in our own families. And the script of Grey's takes this conflict in our hearts and makes it the deep conflict of its story world, the engine that drives every story beat of every episode, season after season. Everyone in the pilot of Grey's Anatomy is constantly striving to be accepted, yet no one ever quite manages to feel that they belong. So they feel constantly like strangers in their own homes. Here's how the pilot establishes that conflict on its opening page. It begins with a voiceover in which Meredith remarks, "The game. They say either a person has what it takes to play or they don't. My mother was one of the greats. Me, on the other hand?" This voiceover is a mini blueprint for Grey's Anatomy's whole engine. There's a game that we were born to play. Our parents are in the Hall of Fame. Yet deep inside, we worry that we don't belong on the field. The pilot's following scene then dramatizes this conflict between belonging and not belonging in a starkly intimate way. Meredith wakes up in her bed, naked. There's a man next to her. He's naked too, but he doesn't know her name, and Meredith feels instantly humiliated. The naked man is pleasant, charming even. He's sympathetic about Meredith's mother, but to Meredith it all feels pretend. So she asks him to leave, and then she quickly flees herself. So with beautiful efficiency, this scene lays out the core conflict of the story world. Meredith is a stranger in her own bed. She's totally intimate with someone who doesn't even know who she is. He's loving to her, but she feels it's all an act. And when he asks if this house is her home, she first says yes, and then changes her answer to kind of. Because those are her two conflicting states of mind. Yes, she belongs here, but then she kind of feels she doesn't. And so we see that the beginning and the ending of Grey's Anatomy work just the same as the beginning and the ending of Game of Thrones. The beginning introduces a cognitive experience that's then intensified at the end. Because this is how the pilots for both soaps and serial dramas work. They introduce their engine immediately and then open the throttle in the final scene. What makes the soap different is the kind of engine it builds. As we saw in our lecture on pilots, the engine of Game of Thrones is about the nature of power. That is, it's about something bigger than humans, out there in the world. The engine for Grey's Anatomy is instead an inside conflict, a conflict in the heart. So if you want to create your own soap, come up with your own original spin on a conflict inside the heart. It doesn't have to be a wildly original spin. Mad Men, for example, is rooted in almost the same feeling as Grey's Anatomy. Like Meredith, the lead character of Mad Men is a stranger in his own life. He takes another man's identity and spends his time making glossy ads about unreal American homes and families. The engine tweak in Mad Men is that where Grey's Anatomy emphasizes the pain of acknowledging our outsideness, Mad Men emphasizes the pain of denying our outsideness, as the characters restlessly struggle to pretend that their fake homes are real. That little shift of emphasis is all you need to create a compelling soap, because to our hearts, little shifts can matter a great deal. So now that we've seen how Grey's establishes its engine, let's look at how it introduces its characters. We'll see that the method here is exactly the same as in procedurals and serial dramas. The main characters are dispersed across the full spectrum of the story world's root conflict, some more on one side of the conflict, some more on the other. And also, like procedurals and serial dramas, the pilot emphasizes its core conflict by opening on a character who's on one extreme of the conflict, and then immediately introducing a character on the other extreme. The first character, as we've seen, is Meredith, who feels strongly on the side of not belonging. And so right after Meredith's introduction, the pilot cuts to a speech delivered in the heart of the hospital by Dr. Richard Weber, the chief of surgery. Weber is presented as the ultimate insider. He belongs about as much as anyone can belong, and his speech reinforces the point. Each of you comes here hopeful, wanting in on the game. But 8 of you will switch to an easier specialty. 5 of you will crack under the pressure. 2 of you will be asked to leave. With this, Weber instantly makes the interns feel like imposters. Sure, they're technically doctors, but they're not part of his special club of surgeons yet. And most of them never will be. They'll crack or quit or fail. So in the first two major scenes, the pilot establishes two opposed characters, a not belonger and a total belonger. And everyone else in the episode falls somewhere on the spectrum between. There are the female interns who are conscious that they're trying to break into a boys' club. But at least they feel like they belong more than the ex-model Izzy. She can't be serious. They're smarter than her. Even the male interns feel like they don't completely belong. Take George. He's mocked by the other interns, pitied by the doctors, and picked as a scapegoat by Burke. And even when George seems to be triumphing in his first surgery, things take a sudden twist for the worse, and Burke yells, "Get him out of here." That's a pitch-perfect line for this pilot. Get him out of here. You can't emphasize not belonging better than that. To drive home George's sense of not belonging, the pilot introduces another brilliant little device. It has the other interns give George a nickname that he doesn't understand. Specifically, they call him 007. Because they smirk, he's got a license to kill. But when George overhears, they won't admit what 007 means. Think about that for a moment. What could make you feel more excluded than being given a nickname you don't understand? The one thing everyone else has in common is that they're secretly laughing at you. Even Christina, the most apparently ruthless of the interns, feels this sense of exclusion. As she remarks bitterly to Meredith, "I don't get picked for surgeries because I slept with my boss, and I didn't get into med school because I have a famous mother. You know, some of us have to earn what we get." And even the top doctors in the pilot don't feel secure. Derek is scolded by an angry father after he admits he can't make a diagnosis. Burke has a massive chip on his shoulder because Derek has been brought in over him. And then there's Dr. Miranda Bailey. She's the ultimate antagonist in the pilot, so much so that the interns nickname her the Nazi. But in the original version of the pilot, she makes this cafeteria confession. "It's not a fair game, you know. They call it a game, act like it's fun. But if you want to be a surgeon, you cheat and you kick and you fight like hell for what you can get. And if they call you a Nazi, so be it." Here, Bailey admits that even she doesn't feel like she belongs. She's a loner trying to break into a rigged game. So when the interns call her the Nazi, it hurts. In the final pilot, this scene was cut to make Bailey a clearer antagonist, but this scene's inclusion in the pilot's earlier drafts reveals the show's deep intention to involve everyone in its central conflict. Everyone wants to fit in, but to some degree, they all feel outside. That's how Grey's introduces its characters, just like Game of Thrones and CSI and MASH. And like these other shows, it also reverse engineers its plot to keep its central conflict going. Every character in Grey's Anatomy wants to belong, but they never feel like they do. So every plotline is about a character striving to fit in with some group, but in the end, failing to make it completely. In the pilot, these plot lines are engineered by giving the interns various mini-trials. Succeed, and they'll be one step closer to becoming a surgeon and feeling like they really belong. Fail, and they'll once again feel on the outside. Izzy is immediately tasked with giving an injection, and then she messes up and is rewarded by being told to do rectal exams. George is tasked with doing an appendectomy, and then he messes up and is ejected from the OR. Meredith is given responsibility for a young girl having seizures, and then she messes up and Derek tells her, just go. So relentlessly, again and again, the pilot script gives the characters little tests, and then it shows them failing and being excluded from the group they want desperately to belong to. One of the most spectacular instances of these mini plot lines is George's interaction with a worried family whose father is going to have heart surgery. George bonds with the family by promising that their father will make it through surgery alive. And this bond means so much to George that even when Christina calls him 007, he responds, "You know what? I don't care. I comforted a family." With this little beat, the script establishes that George finally feels like he belongs. And then the pilot rips this feeling of belonging away by showing the father flatlining in surgery. forcing George to inform the family that he's dead, to which they respond, "Thank you. Please go away. Please go away." Just like that, George is on the outside. He was part of the family, and now he isn't anymore. This is how every plotline in the first season is engineered. A character is given a test to prove themselves, and then, when they succeed, a little plot twist takes it away. The most spectacular of these plot twists in the pilot is Meredith's discovery that the random guy in her bed is in fact her senior attending. Like the twist of the father dying and all the other twists in the show, this twist is specifically engineered to make the character feel like an outsider. How can Meredith ever belong in the hospital now? How can she ever be respected by her boss and by the other interns? Instantly, she knows there will always be gossip, always people talking behind her back, just like they talk about 007. The larger point here is that when you plot your own soap, don't think there's some magic formula for how many subplots you need or what things should happen before what commercial break. The purpose of a soap is to keep returning to the same emotional conflict over and over. So to reverse engineer those returns, take each of your characters and create little challenges for them that hold out the promise of resolving the conflict. Then interrupt your characters' moments of triumph with a sharp plot twist that plunges them back into their original dilemma, so that the show's engine goes on and on and on. To give yourself a little more plot to work with, you can also bake in one of the procedural elements that we learned about in our lecture on CSI, like the pilot for Grey's Anatomy does by introducing the need to solve difficult hospital mysteries. A lot of soaps introduce this sort of procedural element, whether a crime procedural element like in NYPD Blue, or a fantasy procedural element like in Buffy, or a workplace procedural element like in Mad Men. But crucially, for a soap to be a soap and not a procedural, the soap engine always needs to govern the action of the procedural element. Here's how it works in the pilot of Grey's Anatomy. Derek kicks off the problem solving by asking the interns for help. He's got a patient who's a mystery. Her labs are clean, her scans are pure, but she's having seizures, grand mal seizures. She's gonna die if he can't figure it out. So Derek tells the interns, "I need you to play detective. I need you to find out why she's having seizures." You can't have a clearer introduction of a procedural element into a soap than a doctor being told to, quote, play detective. And over the episode, the detective-playing interns go at it, trying to crack the case. But in the end, the solution is not achieved through some rigorous scientific method, like in CSI or House. Instead, the solution comes from an emotional intuition. Meredith and Christina approach Derek in the elevator and tell him that they've got a hunch. Derek responds by pointing out that their hunch is wildly unlikely, irrational even. As he puts it, the chances are 1 in a million, literally. But then the docs do a scan, and to Derek's surprise, Meredith's 1 in a million hunch is correct. This solution is the total opposite of a CSI solution. It's illogical and entirely emotional. And yet, the logic of the world of Grey's is the logic of emotion. Its laws of physics are lucky socks, poetic justice, and wish fulfillment. And so it is that Meredith's dream comes true, and the procedural becomes folded into the soap. Let's now add the last big story element to our soap opera blueprint by reverse engineering the how and the what of Grey's Anatomy's tone. The tone of soap operas is always sentimental, following the model of storytelling we explored back in our introductory lectures on tone. So everything in the world is portrayed from the perspective of how the characters feel about it. In Grey's Anatomy, the pilot's most powerful technique for creating this sentimental tone is Meredith's voiceover. We've talked in earlier lectures about how voiceover creates sympathy in the viewing audience. And that's because the way to build sympathy is through some form of soliloquy. That is, through a character's outward expression of their inner emotional conflict. And since all the characters in a TV show are windows into the world's core conflict, Whatever the characters express their internal worldview in a voiceover, it's almost always a soliloquy that generates feelings of sympathetic identification. We get this in Meredith's opening soliloquy when she expresses her conflict between wanting to play the game and feeling like she can't. And the same voiceover technique injects sympathy into the final beats of the pilot. Here, Meredith says, "The other interns are all good people. You'd like them, I think. I don't know. Maybe. I like them." That's a classic little soliloquy. I think, I don't know. To be, or maybe not to be. Because like Hamlet, Meredith is torn. Part of her feels like she knows what her mother would think, and part of her doesn't. Part of her feels like family, and part of her feels like a stranger. If you're writing a soap, there's no better way to build a sentimental tone than through voiceovers like this. So don't use voiceovers just to express what your characters think. Use it to express the deep emotional conflict in your characters' hearts, creating sympathy in your viewer's mind for the core conflict of your story world. Now let's sum up our blueprint for soap writing by looking at a scene that captures the whole engine of Grey's Anatomy at work. The scene is right at the end of the pilot, when Dr. Weber humiliates Alex for failing to diagnose a patient. And after Alex and all the other interns stammer helplessly in response to Dr. Weber's questions, Meredith steps in and nails the diagnosis. Weber reacts by telling Alex, "I want you off the case." Then he tells Meredith, "Welcome to the gang." This is an enormously satisfying scene because it's a prime instance of poetic justice. The script has repeatedly marked Alex out as a bad guy. He's condescending to nurses, and he doesn't care about his patients. So when Alex gets his comeuppance, we love it. That's classic soap writing. It feeds our emotional hunger for justice. But what makes this scene really smart is that it also fuels the specific engine that makes Grey's Anatomy its own special soap. First of all, this scene reveals that in the story world of this soap, belonging always has to be paired with a feeling of not belonging. Meredith only becomes part of the gang when Alex is kicked off the case. Otherwise, if it was possible for all the characters to belong at once, the conflict in the story world would weaken and the show's engine would sputter. Second, this scene brilliantly sets up the pilot's closing twist, the reveal that Meredith's mother has Alzheimer's. Because when Weber welcomes Meredith into the gang, this is really just to set Meredith up for the emotional reverse of the final scene, where she ends up feeling like a stranger to her own mother. In other words, this story beat with Dr. Weber is classic reverse engineering. To make the final scene of not belonging really hurt, the script builds back this scene where, for a moment, the character finally feels she fits in. It has Meredith drop her guard before the last punch comes in. So that's the blueprint for launching your next soap. First, build your engine by pinpointing a particular conflict in the human heart. Maybe it's a feeling you've had. Maybe it's a feeling that you've seen in others. Next, write an ending for your pilot that captures the psychological experience of both sides of that conflict in the heart. And adopt a sentimental tone that expresses how that conflict feels. Then create one main character who offers a window into one extreme side of the conflict. Introduce her first. Then create a second character who offers a window into the other extreme. Introduce him second, establishing the conflict. Then introduce a few more characters who fall on the spectrum in between, showing how the heart's conflict permeates the world. And reverse engineer a plot by showing how these different characters struggle to get to one side of the conflict, aided by wish fulfillment and poetic justice, only in the end to suffer a surprise twist and get pulled back. And if you'd like, layer in a procedural element. Just make sure that the procedure for solving the problem is an emotional procedure, reflecting the world of the soap. Because in soap operas, the answer is always what we feel. If you'd like to get started on creating a soap, here are a couple exercises to get you going. First, watch an episode of your favorite soap. Identify its engine, and then tweak it slightly, modifying the deep conflict in the heart. Second, create two characters to act as windows into your new engine. The first, who's on one side of the conflict, and the second, who's on the opposite. Then write an opening scene where we meet the first character, and a second scene where the two characters collide. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of the course. You've proved you've got the grit it takes to be a writer. Either that or you just decided to see if this course was going anywhere by skipping ahead. In which case, congratulations to you too. You'll need that kind of independent thinking to make it in this business. That's because there is no cookie-cutter formula for writing scripts. There's a massive library of story structures and innovations spanning across history and cultures and human minds that you can tweak and adapt to move audiences in different ways. So don't ever feel like there's one right way to write a script. You've got enormous creative freedom as a storyteller to branch out, to experiment, and to innovate. And if that freedom ever starts to feel overwhelming, get your bearings by returning to the scripts that you love the most. And instead of trying to distill their universal rules, identify the unique qualities of their characters and plots and worlds that move your heart and your mind in special ways. So get personal and get specific, tracking back from story effects that you like to the story parts that make them go. That's reverse engineering. It allows you to be flexible but precise. True to yourself, but focused on what's worked for audiences before. And more than anything else, the goal of this course has been to make you comfortable with this simple, ancient storytelling process. It's worked for Shakespeare, it's worked for Pixar, and it can work for you. So in this, our final lecture, we'll stick to our reverse engineering method by asking you to choose where you want the story of this course to end. Because by learning how scripts work, you've been learning how narrative works. And there's almost no end to the things that you can do with narrative. Narrative allows us to plot our days. It allows us to prepare for the future. It allows us to problem solve by coming up with plans of action. It allows us to envision the complex steps needed to create new artworks, or found new companies, or invent new forms of technology. And it also allows us to fashion our identities. We're part of families, groups, businesses, clubs, schools, associations, nations, and global networks that tell stories about themselves, narratives about their identity, and plots for their futures. So narrative allows us to act more coherently, more flexibly, more communally, more purposefully. If you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty science of how narrative works, you can apply to get a PhD or an MFA with me and the other faculty of Project Narrative. But really, there's no better way to enlarge your own narrative skills than by practicing the three things that we've set out in this course to do. Appreciate more films and TV, tell better stories, and write your own scripts. So let's start with how you can use this course to develop your appreciation for films and TV. What does it mean to better appreciate a film or a TV series? Well, it means to enjoy it more deeply, to feel your heart and your mind more fully engaged, to forget yourself and feel transported somewhere new. A lot of times when this doesn't happen, we blame the movie, and there's no doubt the movies can be at fault. Like anything else, they can be badly made. But there are lots of times when the movie is just fine and we're the ones who could be doing more. And you can almost always be sure that this is the case when other people love a movie and you don't. That's why we've dedicated this course to wildly celebrated and influential film and TV scripts. Millions of people have been moved by these scripts, so the odds are good that you can be too. Hopefully, at some point in this course, you've developed this new appreciation for a script. You weren't expecting to like it, but then something clicked in your mind and you felt a sudden moment of romance or wonder or suspense. If this didn't happen, look back over the titles and pick one that you don't get, but that one of your friends or family members enjoys. So you're not just trying to enjoy it for you. You're doing it to share an experience with someone you care about. Because the best part of life is the experiences you share. Then listen to the lecture and write down one thing. Write down the character's conflict with their story world. Think about moments in your own life where you felt a similar conflict, or situations in which you might feel it. And try to imagine why you'd be afraid to lose this conflict. What would it cost you? How would it hurt? Now rewatch the opening of the movie, attempting to feel for the character as they struggle with similar fears. If you can feel the main character's fears, the whole experience of the movie will unlock for you. Well, once you've done that with a few of the scripts in this course, what if you want to take the next step? What if you want to watch films and TV shows that there aren't lectures for? And what if you don't want to ruin them by knowing the ending first? Let's start with TV shows. With a TV show, if you can appreciate the pilot, you can appreciate any episode. And the core conflict of the pilot should be there in the opening scene. So re-watch that scene to find it. If it's a procedural, what's the problem and what's the problem solver? If it's a soap, what's the core emotional struggle? Once you've found the conflict, try to imagine feeling it in your own life. And watch the show, honing in on that feeling of conflict until the story takes you away. You can do the same basic thing with films. Watch the first few minutes carefully to identify the core conflict between the character and their story world. If you can't find it, rewatch the first two scenes. 99% of the time, it's there. Or you can ask the person you're watching the film with, what's the character fighting against? What are they most afraid of happening? Then ask yourself, have I ever had a similar fear? If you can feel that fear, you can feel for the character and their conflict. Then you'll be in and the story will start to flow. So that's how this course can help you better appreciate film and TV. By reverse engineering, you've learned to isolate the conflict between characters and their story world, and to then work back from that conflict to the deep fear that drives it. And on a biological level, that fear is the key for your brain to experience empathy and maybe even sympathy for the characters, carrying you on your journey with them. Now, let's talk about how this course can help you be a more effective storyteller. The first thing to remember is that there isn't one right way to storytell. Everyone has their own storytelling style, and you don't want to lose that. But you can improve your stories in the same organic way that you can improve a script, simply by reverse engineering. First, remember that the point of a story is to take your audience to a particular cognitive destination, to make them feel or think a certain way. So start by asking yourself, what emotion do I want to evoke in my audience's hearts? What state of mind do I want to impart? Do I want them to laugh? Do I want them to be charmed? Do I want them to feel sympathy? Do I want them to be amazed? If you're already a pretty good storyteller, but you've got a particular story that's not working quite right, think about what you want that story to do. Then think about another story you've got that achieves that intended effect, and ask yourself, what story beat or narrative twist or other plot structure does my effective story have that my less effective story doesn't? So for example, you might notice that your best stories begin with you making a little self-deprecating remark about yourself, or that your best stories have a little ironic twist at the end, or that your best stories have a logic of the heart to them. That's one of your distinctive personal ingredients for a good story. So import it into any of your stories that aren't working so well. Now let's say that you don't have a strong personal storytelling style, or that you want to branch out and enrich your narrative repertoire. All you have to do is identify a story that has a cognitive effect that you want to replicate, and then reverse engineer it and borrow its hidden recipe. To start this process, you can begin by stealing the recipes for all the scripts we've studied in this course, because these scripts open up an enormous variety of different ways to move audiences. If you want to charm like the Princess Bride, practice telling your stories with a light irony. If you want to create wonder like Star Wars, start with an ordinary thing that suddenly offers a glimpse of a much bigger something beyond. And if your stories still aren't working quite right, here's 2 simple screenwriting tricks you can use to troubleshoot. First, the one thing that almost all good scripts do is generate suspense, which they do by setting the stage with a conflict between a person and their world, creating a problem or obstacle or fear that the person has to overcome. This staging of a conflict creates suspense by making the audience wonder, how will that warrior princess save her home planet? How will that old cowboy get justice? How will that pregnant cop wrest meaning from the void? So when you start your stories, don't just start them anywhere. Start by clearly establishing a personal challenge or a public crisis or some other character story world conflict that generates suspense and stakes and makes your audience wonder, how will this problem be fixed? Will it take an ironic turn into the tragic? Or will it have some unforeseen happy twist or triumph? The second broad script writing technique for troubleshooting your stories is to enrich them with a deeper human interest so that your audience cares more about what happens to the characters. To do this, remember that the secret recipe for empathy is to reveal a character's fears. So when you tell stories about yourself, go ahead and let the audience see your vulnerabilities and anxieties. And if you want to create the even deeper bond of sympathy, confess your indecision and your competing fears, connecting your audience to the deepest struggles of your heart. Now, let's turn to the third of the 3 things that this course can help you do, and that's write a script of your own. This third end is really the culmination of the other 2. Because the better you can appreciate films and tell stories, the better you can write a script. So you always want to be working on both of these other 2 skills. Be a dedicated student of the scripts and stories you admire. And don't ever stop storytelling. Do it constantly. Tell little anecdotes about your day to your friends. Make up bedtime stories for your younger family members. Introduce yourself to new people by telling them your life as a 10-second movie. There's always more room for stories in your life. Then, when it's time to combine these 2 skills and write your next script, start by getting yourself a blueprint. We've derived 18 blueprints in this course, so hopefully one of them has clicked for you. But let's say that none of them have. Maybe you didn't like any of the scripts, or maybe our analyses didn't capture your personal sense of the script. Maybe you didn't find Pulp Fiction surreal. Maybe you just found it comic or totally disturbing. Maybe you didn't find Toy Story to be an embrace of human mortality. Maybe you found it sweetly fun. Maybe you didn't find The Godfather tragic. Maybe it made you want to be the next Don. That's totally normal because our brains are all a little different. In this course, we've reverse engineered our blueprints out of the most typical cognitive responses to a script. But none of us is typical all the time, and some of us aren't ever typical at all. So if you like one or more of the blueprints we've derived, that's great. You can steal it. But if you don't like any of the blueprints, don't worry. Since the purpose of this course isn't to force you to stick to any single plot structure, the important thing is not the blueprints themselves. The important thing is the method we used for making these blueprints. That's the core insight for you to take from our lectures. Because even if you don't like any of the blueprints we've derived, the method that we use to reverse engineer them can guide you to whatever blueprint you need to create your next script. So start by getting a copy of a script you admire and identifying the cognitive effect of the script's ending as precisely as you can, using any language to describe it that works for you. Then go through the script, isolating the different story elements that generate this cognitive effect. If it's a TV pilot, the key story element is the engine, or conflict, in the world. You'll find it clearly established in both the first and final scenes of the pilot, and it'll also be the conflict between the first two main characters to be introduced. You'll know you found the engine because when you imagine its conflict, it'll immediately make you feel the cognitive effect of the entire series. If you're instead reverse engineering a film script, begin by identifying the special rule of the story world, which you can locate either in the opening scene or in the antagonist's behavior. Next, determine the main character's conflict with this world rule and isolate the fear that fuels the conflict. Then move on to the plot. Write down the main story beats, the moments in the plot where something major changes, so you summarize the plot's whole action with the minimum steps needed. If you go through these beats in reverse, from the end to the beginning, reviewing the author's story choices, you'll discover the deep storytelling logic that connects them. Steal that deep storytelling logic and leave the story beats behind. Finally, identify the what and the how of the tone. What parts of the story world and the characters does the script focus on? And how does it talk about them? With a God's eye, or with irony, or with sentiment, or with a comic generosity? So that's story world, character, plot, and tone. And there you go. You've reverse engineered your own blueprint. And the more you do it, the faster you'll get. If you read one script a week, you'll have 50 blueprints this time next year. So how do you know what blueprint to choose for your next script? This is where you get to exercise your creative freedom, because it all comes down to the cognitive effect you want to create. Big wonder or charm, alienation or existentialism, romantic longing or romantic satisfaction. Pick the blueprint that carries your audience's mind where you want them to go. Once you've picked your blueprint, start with your ending. For your first few scripts, that ending should be similar in its broad outlines to the ending in your blueprint. So if your blueprint is Toy Story, have two strangers bond as they overcome a common life challenge, only to end by seeing the challenge resurface. Or if your blueprint is Unforgiven, have your anti-hero do something monstrous to make the world a better place. Or if your blueprint is MASH, the TV series, have two characters look back together over the good and the bad of a shared experience. Or if your blueprint is Game of Thrones, have a character learn something that hurts. Don't panic if that final scene isn't perfect or even very good yet. Remember Woody Allen and Annie Hall, or what happened with Chinatown. The major purpose of that final scene is to help you reverse engineer everything else, so it can be a placeholder that you replace later with something better. If you're writing a pilot, your next step is to reverse engineer your engine. What deep conflict in a story world would produce your chosen cognitive effect? How can you put your own unique twist on that conflict if it seems a little too similar to another TV series that you know? Then write a pilot that relentlessly establishes this engine through its opening scene, through the external conflict between its first two main characters, through the internal conflict between the other main characters, and through its plot and its tone. If you're instead reverse engineering a film, the first thing to do is figure out the tone of your ending. Is it meant to be ironic or heartwarming or epic or something else? Whoever talks in that tone is your narrator. The next thing to do is reverse engineer your world character conflict, which again you can do by building back from your ending. First, ask yourself whether the story world in your final scene is the same as it was in the beginning. As we've seen in many genres, like comedies and tragedies and Brechtian alienation narratives, it is. In which case, the next step is to reverse engineer your story world by asking yourself, what kind of world that final scene could happen in? Once you've figured out the rules of that world, then reverse engineer a character in conflict with one of those rules. On the other hand, if your story world changes over the course of the plot, like it does in heroic narratives, ask yourself, what changes about the world in my final story beats? That change is your character's main rule of action. And now that you've got your character's main rule of action, you simply reverse engineer your story world to have a rule in conflict with it. So to sum that up, to reverse engineer your story world character conflict, ask yourself whether the world at the end of your script is the same as at the beginning. If it is, you first reverse engineer your story world and then build back your character in conflict. If it isn't, you do the opposite and reverse engineer your character first, then build back a story world in conflict. Once you've got your characters and your story world, rough out your plot by working back from your final scene to create the action beats you need to get you there. If you get stuck or lost, ask yourself questions like, what would make my character more afraid than anything? What would threaten the big rule of my story world more than anything? The answers to those questions will give you some new story beats to build back from. And if you run dry of inspiration, crack open your blueprint and borrow some of its general plot points, adjusting their details to work for you. This deep reliance on an older blueprint can sometimes feel derivative. But we saw back in the first lecture that it's what Shakespeare did. And the more he did it, the more original his writing became. This originality is the ultimate goal of reverse engineering. Hollywood needs new scripts. The world needs new stories. So nothing I've said in the preceding lectures should be taken as absolute law. If you get on a roll and start breaking the rules, that's great. That's what the best writing does. But the reason we've laid out some big guidelines in this course about how to establish story world or character or plot is to help you when you get stuck or things aren't working. So if you've written a script that no one else seems to get, take a look back at some of the suggestions in these lectures. If readers aren't excited by the possibilities of your story world or find your ending implausible or arbitrary, go back and clarify the opening scene where you show, don't tell your new genre rule. If readers don't connect to your characters, sharpen and heighten your characters' fears. If your plot is overly crammed or has loose threads or hitches, remember the cognitive effect you want to achieve and reverse engineer back through your scenes, cutting and tightening story beats that don't contribute to this end. You'd be surprised at how many scripts are transformed from barely readable into brilliant simply by cutting. Cutting releases the form from the rock, clarifying the story and bringing the stakes and the emotional arcs into focus. If the plot stalls or drifts or feels boring, go back and crank up the conflict. If the lag in your script's dramatic tension or suspense is just occasional, you can fix it on a scene-by-scene basis. But if the story seems more fundamentally lacking in urgencies or stakes or purpose, return to the beginning and hammer out a clear and intense opening conflict between your main character and your story world in your first two scenes. If the dialogue seems cliched or stereotypical, or your characters all talk alike, go back to each of your characters and trace their fears back to their pre-script past, figuring out the individual vocabularies or dialects or habits of speech that they've developed over time. And if your character or action descriptions don't pop, or if the tone seems dry or lacking in flair, improve your narrator by firmly nailing down his what and his how, seeking some inspiration from your favorite novels or memoirs. And whatever you do, don't quit on your script if it doesn't work the first time. Remember what we saw back in our lecture on the failed Game of Thrones pilot. These writers fixed the script by going back to their blueprint and revising their script to bring it more in line with their chosen engine. And you can do the same. Most writing is rewriting, so go back and revise, tweaking and adjusting your story world and your characters and your plot and your tone until everything clicks with your blueprint. After you've written your first script, you'll want to share it because the point of a story is to connect with an audience. So you'll want to see how effectively you've connected. If you want honest feedback that doesn't wreck your current relationships, it's best to build a group of writing friends, people who you respect and enjoy talking stories with. Listen to their notes, but remember, writing groups are better at identifying problems with your stories than giving you solutions. If you follow through on other people's notes, you risk making your script a Frankenstein, a collection of different parts from different people. And spoiler alert, the story of Frankenstein doesn't end well. So when someone tells you that something in your script doesn't work, accept their criticism of what's broken, but try to fix it in your own way. Go back to your ending and remember what effect you're trying to accomplish. And stick to your blueprint when you troubleshoot, so you're not just tinkering haphazardly. You're working with your plan in mind. When you feel pretty good about one of your scripts, it's time to get it out into the world. One way to get your script out there is to get it made into an indie film so it can be screened at film festivals. There's almost guaranteed to be a film festival within a day's drive of you, and if you're lucky, there will be one or two much closer. So before you make your script into a film, attend a film festival or two and meet people and enjoy films and get a sense of how the festival works. Then get together with some people you meet there and create and submit your own film. If your film takes off on the festival circuit, you'll touch a huge audience and you'll meet new friends and collaborators and you'll get to make more films. If you're looking to break more directly into the industry without getting involved in production, one way is through a script contest. The two best film script contests are the Academy Nicholl Fellowship and the Sundance Institute Lab Program. You can find the applications online, and if you place in either contest, that'll help you land an agent. The Academy Nicholl Award is what gave me my start. If you're writing TV scripts instead, many of the major television networks like ABC Disney, NBC, and CBS have their own script contests. So apply to those. They'll open a lot of doors if you win. One other way into Hollywood is through a development company. These are companies run by successful writers or directors or actors or former studio execs who develop and even package and produce scripts. If you don't know anyone at a development company, look up some ones that have made TV series or films that you've liked. You can use a service called imdbpro.com to find all their credits and their contact info. And while no development company will ever take blind script submissions, they often hire interns and assistants, giving you a chance to learn the ropes and make connections. So give them a call or drop them an email to find out about their internship programs. And if you go online, you'll see that all of the studios and networks have internship programs too. And once you figure out how to get your foot in the door, the secret to getting further is to learn how to pitch. Pitching is that thing you do to excite and inspire people to read your script. Young screenwriters often think that a good pitch should condense their script down to a tidy plot summary, like a kind of snappy logline. But really, the key to a good pitch is more subtle than that. Rather than handing your audience a finished story, you want to hand them a hooky beginning, kicking off a narrative chain reaction in their brains so that they start telling your story themselves. That's why when you're pitching, plot summaries are usually a bad way to start. Plot summaries don't build intrigue. Instead, they kill the suspense by revealing too much. So when you're preparing a pitch, think about how you can hook your audience the same way that the first page of a script hooks a reader. You want to grab their attention with the story, so they start imagining the plot on their own. They'll wonder, does it go this way, or does it go that? Their mind will be filled with story possibilities. And you know you've got a good pitch when people get excited and start imagining all the different ways the plot could go. Just like you know you've got a good TV series when your audience keeps trying to predict what's going to happen next week. Some writers are just naturally good at pitching. But if you want to get better, the best way to start is by studying the beginnings of your favorite scripts and identifying the precise story way that they hook you. Sometimes they grab your curiosity by posing a puzzle or a mystery. Sometimes they forge an emotional bond by showing a character in a moment of crisis. Sometimes they create wonder by opening the prospect of a new world. So borrow the tricks of these scripts and make your audience feel like a detective or a confidant or an explorer. There's lots of different ways to pitch, and some of them will be more natural to you. To find and refine what works for you, you'll want to practice pitching. And the simplest way to practice is to pitch your favorite films and TV shows to friends who haven't seen them yet. Can you excite such interest in the story that your friend wants to see it right away? If you can, you've made a good pitch. So give it a shot. After this lecture is done, go pitch to a friend. Get them excited to see something new. And once you've gotten good at pitching films and TV shows that already exist, start pitching your own shows so you can get them made. Now, I have to be honest with you. It's not easy to break into Hollywood. It takes more than hard work and talent. It takes luck. More luck than you can always make for yourself. And it also takes a certain kind of ego. You have to be crazy enough to think that you'll be the one in a million, but you also have to be selfless enough to always listen to your audience. Because what you want always matters less than what your audience wants. And while there are lots of different audiences out there for you to choose from, at the end of the day, all of them will want you to put them first. That's why it's so important to practice pitching, because a good pitch is all about pleasing your audience. But of course, even the best pitch will only get you so far. There has to be a script behind it that lives up to expectations. So to ensure that your audience-pleasing pitches aren't just empty promises, never stop writing. Get a screenwriting program and write for an hour each day. If you're an early riser, maybe it's the first thing you do when you wake up. If you like to burn the midnight oil, maybe it's after everyone else is asleep. Because by writing a little each day, you'll get better. And the world can always use a better story or two.
Lecture 1, retake. Marker.
With these opening beats, the script for Hamlet shows us... sorry guys.
The days of me forgetting are over. The days of me remembering have just begun.
You know, when you go on like this, what you sound like?
I sound like a sensible f***ing man.
You sound like a duck. Quack, quack, quack. Quack, quack, quack.
Whenever I see a big pair of feet or a cheesy mustache, I'll think of you.
Whenever I smell month-old socks, I'll think of you.
And the next time somebody nails my shoes to the floor,
And when somebody gives me a martini that tastes like lighter fluid,
I'll miss you.
I'll miss you a lot. I can't imagine what this place would have been like if I hadn't found you here.
Trust me. That's all I can tell you about my business.
Liar.
So intense! So intense! So intense! Oh, I do that again.
Marvin, what do you make of all this?
Man, I don't even have an opinion.
You gotta have an opinion. You think God came down from heaven and stopped, bang!
What the f***'s happening?
Oh man, I shot Marvin in the face.
What the f*** you do that?
I didn't mean it.
I think we should just be friends.
I don't want friends.
I was being polite. I have no intention of being friends with you. Okay. Well, it's really hard to break up with this beautiful little face. I'm just gonna get through it. Okay.
So that's the God's Eye narrator. And making you into an important... Sorry, guys. Now let's say that you don't have a strong personal storytelling style, or that you want to branch out and enrich your narrative repertoire. Sorry, guys, I think I should do that again. That was...
Hey, they were going to the Twin Cities. Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Is that useful to you?
Oh, you betcha.
I missed a yaw.
It's so Scottish.
Sorry.
You can't stop now, though.
Is it true? Is it?
No.
I guess we both need a drink, huh?
Don Corleone. Can we get a close-up of my hand, like caressing his hand?
Yeah, that's probably better than my awkward.
R and round. Sit in a...
All right, One more time.